Act 6. Chapter 1. The joint research effort between the Gregory and the Gremory family's archives began within days of Rias's conversation with her brother, Surzex, proving, exactly as Rias had predicted, entirely receptive to the proposal once he understood the stakes involved. Scholars from both factions, along with representatives Yasaka and Susan sent from their own considerable archives, gathered in a specially arranged wing of the Gremory estate, ancient texts and fragile scrolls spread carefully across long tables under the watchful care of researchers trained specifically for handling documents that predated most currently recognized history. The arrangement itself required careful diplomatic navigation, Surzex personally overseeing the initial handoff of several particularly sensitive Gremory family texts, his easy warmth doing much to smooth what might otherwise have been a tense first meeting between historically wary devil archivists and their newly arrived fallen angel counterparts. My family has guarded some of these records for longer than most current factions have existed in their present form, he explained to Issei, during a brief visit to oversee the research wing's opening days. I do not make this access available lightly. But I trust the purpose behind it, and I trust, having watched you these past months, that you will handle whatever we uncover together with the same careful judgment you've shown consistently since this all began. Thank you, Issei said, genuinely moved by the trust being extended. I won't take that lightly. I know, Surzex said, a warm, genuine smile touching his expression. That is rather the entire reason I'm comfortable extending it in the first place. Issei visited periodically throughout the following weeks, though the bulk of the painstaking scholarly work fell, understandably, to those with the training and patience for it. Azazel himself making regular appearances alongside a rotating team of Gregory researchers, cross-referencing fragments against Yasaka's own considerable collection of Kitsune records with the same rigorous, careful attention he brought to everything. We've found something, Azazel said during one such visit, his usual casual demeanor giving way to focused excitement as he gestured Issei toward a table covered in carefully unrolled scrolls. A more complete account than anything I'd previously located, describing what appears to be the seal's original construction. It's fragmentary still, but considerably more detailed than what we started with. Issei studied the ancient text, understanding little of the actual script but recognizing, in the accompanying illustrations, the same dragon and fox motifs he'd seen carved into the veiled threshold's ancient stone. What does it say? According to this account, Azazel explained, the seal wasn't built to contain something evil, exactly, at least not in the way the word is typically understood. It was built to contain something incomplete. The fractured entity we've been calling the root, or the first flame, apparently never fully died when it split into the various draconic and Yokai bloodlines. What remained, the seal was built to protect, both from the world and, more importantly, from itself. From itself? Issei repeated, confused. Incomplete things tend toward instability, Azazel explained. Imagine losing most of yourself, scattered across thousands of descendants over countless generations, while some small, conscious fragment of you remains, aware of everything it's lost but unable to reclaim it naturally. That kind of existence, according to this account, tends to breed something closer to desperate hunger than deliberate malice. The seal wasn't built as a prison for a monster. It was built as a kind of careful containment for something in genuine, ongoing pain, something that might, if left unchecked, seek to reclaim its scattered pieces by force, regardless of the cost to the bloodlines those pieces now belong to. The weight of that revelation settled heavily over Issei, an uncomfortable, unexpected sympathy stirring alongside the very real danger the fragment apparently still represented. That's not what I expected to hear, he admitted. It rarely is, with histories this old, Azazel said. The deeper you dig, the more these things tend to resist easy categorization. Villain and victim aren't always as separate as we'd like them to be, especially not across spans of time this considerable. Drake's voice stirred quietly within Issei's mind as the conversation continued, carrying a note of consideration Issei had rarely heard from the ancient dragon across their time bonded together. If this account holds true, partner, it changes something I have wondered about myself, across all my considerable years. I have always felt a strange, indefinable kinship towards certain other dragons, an echo of something shared that never quite made sense given how fiercely independent most of my kind typically are. Perhaps that echo traces back further than even I understood. Does that bother you? Issei asked quietly, relaying the thought to the gathered group. Finding out where it actually comes from. It unsettles me somewhat, Drake admitted. I have spent centuries considering myself entirely my own creature, shaped by my own choices and my own considerable pride. Learning that some deeper, ancient fracture may have shaped even that sense of self more than I realized, that is not an easy thing to simply accept without some measure of discomfort. For what it's worth, Issei said, I don't think it changes who you actually are. Whatever the original source, you've spent centuries being exactly the dragon you chose to become. That doesn't stop being true just because we understand a little more about where it started. Drake was quiet for a long moment before responding, something that might have been quiet gratitude coloring his ancient voice. That is, perhaps, more wisdom than I expected from you on this particular subject, partner. I will consider it carefully. Yasaka, arriving partway through the conversation, studied the newly translated fragment with careful, thoughtful attention. If this account holds true, it changes how we should think about any future encounter with this fragment. Not simply a threat to be defeated, but potentially something requiring an entirely different approach altogether. What kind of approach? Issei asked. I do not yet know, Yasaka admitted honestly. But I suspect, given everything we have learned about your own particular history, Issei, that understanding and compassion may prove more useful tools here than raw strength alone. You have, after all, spent 5 months proving exactly that approach's value against threats far less ancient and complicated than this one. That evening, back at the clubroom, Issei found himself relaying the day's discovery to the rest of his peerage, watching their reactions carefully as the implications settled over the familiar, comfortable room. Something in pain, rather than something evil, Asia said quietly, once he'd finished explaining. That changes things, doesn't it? Not the danger, exactly, but how we should think about facing it, if it ever comes to that. I think so, Issei said. I keep thinking about what Yasaka said, about compassion mattering as much as strength. But I don't really know what that looks like yet, not for something this old, and this broken. You'll figure it out, Kaneko said, with her usual quiet certainty. You always do, eventually. Usually by just being honest instead of clever about it. I hope it's that simple, Issei admitted, managing a tired laugh. Somehow I doubt it will be. Kiba, cleaning his blade with the same careful attention he brought to every quiet evening, offered his own thoughtful addition. Whatever it turns out to require, I don't think any of us expect you to face it alone. That much, at least, hasn't changed since the very beginning of all this. No, Issei agreed, warmth settling into his chest despite the weight of the day's revelations. It hasn't. I don't think it's going to either. Chapter 2. The research continued over the following weeks, each new fragment adding further, sobering context to the picture slowly assembling itself from centuries of scattered, incomplete records. It was Susan, arriving personally to review the accumulated findings alongside Yasaka and Meihua, who brought forward the most concerning discovery yet, a detailed account, considerably more complete than anything previously located, describing a past sovereign's attempt at full restoration rather than simple containment. His name was lost to most records, Susan explained, laying out the fragile scroll with careful reverence. Referred to only as the bound flame sovereign in what survives, likely a title rather than a true name, given how deliberately the old records seemed to have avoided preserving his actual identity. He lived, by the account's own internal references, nearly 6 centuries ago, and he believed, as I suspect you might understand the temptation, Issei, that a sovereign capable of drawing on both fractured aspects of the ancient power should be capable of properly healing the fracture itself, rather than simply managing its ongoing containment. What happened? Issei asked, though the grave weight already settling over the gathered group suggested he already understood the answer would not be a happy one. He attempted full restoration, Susan said. Drawing on the combined strength of every clan then aligned with his coalition, considerably larger, by this account's description, than what you have built so far. The attempt failed catastrophically. Rather than healing the fracture, the ritual instead destabilized the seal considerably, requiring the combined effort of every surviving ally to reinforce it afterward, at tremendous cost. The sovereign himself did not survive the attempt. Neither did roughly a third of the clans who had bound their strength to the ritual alongside him. Kunou, who had quietly joined the gathering despite the conversation's evident weight, spoke up from her usual place near the room's edge, her expression troubled in a way that suggested the history had struck her more personally than the others might have anticipated. That means clans just like ours, families just like ours, actually died. Because he tried to fix something too fast. Yes, Yasaka said gently, unwilling to soften the truth even for her daughter's evident distress. That is precisely what happened, Kunou. It is a difficult history, but an important one to understand honestly, rather than treating it as simply a distant cautionary tale. I don't want that to happen here, Kunou said quietly. To any of the people I've gotten to know these past months. Neither do any of us, Issei said, meeting her gaze directly. That's exactly why we're being so careful. Why we're taking the time to actually understand this properly, instead of rushing towards some quick solution just because the problem feels urgent. Good, Kunou said, some of her earlier distress easing, though her expression remained more solemn than usual for the rest of the gathering. The gravity of that history settled over the room like a physical weight, and Issei found himself, not for the first time since Azazel's initial revelation, deeply aware of just how much danger this ancient, fractured power genuinely represented. Why would he even attempt something that dangerous? Rias asked, her strategic mind clearly working through the implications with careful, sober attention. The account suggests desperation, Susan said. The seal had been weakening in his era as well, considerably faster than what we observed at the veiled threshold. He believed, likely correctly, that simple reinforcement would only delay an inevitable failure, and that a permanent solution, however risky, represented the only genuine path forward. Whether he was right about that assessment, the surviving records do not definitively answer. What they do make clear is that his particular approach, rushed and insufficiently prepared, ended in catastrophe. Issei studied the ancient account's fragile pages, searching for some detail that might humanize the long-dead sovereign beyond the brief, cautionary framing Susan's translation offered. Does it say anything else about him? What kind of person he actually was before all of this? Susan considered the question carefully before answering. Very little survives directly, though what does suggest he was, by most contemporary accounts, considered wise and well regarded among his own coalition, not reckless by nature. That is, I think, precisely what makes this account so worth heeding carefully. He was not a fool rushing blindly toward disaster. He was a careful, respected leader who allowed desperation to override caution he otherwise possessed in considerable measure. That is a far more sobering lesson than a simple tale of foolish overreach would have been. It sounds like exactly the kind of mistake I could see myself making someday, Issei admitted quietly. If things got bad enough, if I felt like I was running out of time the way he apparently did. That is precisely why this history matters, Yasaka said, her tone gentle but firm. Not as a warning against ever acting decisively, but as a reminder that decisiveness born of desperation rarely produces the careful, considered judgment genuine crises actually require. We will not allow ourselves to reach that same desperate point, Issei. That is, in part, why we pursue this research now, patiently, while the seal remains stable enough to afford us the time to do so properly. Meiwa, studying the account with the same careful, historian's attention she brought to every piece of ancient knowledge, added her own sobering observation. This confirms something my own clan's fragmented legends only hinted at. There is precedent for exactly the outcome we most fear, a sovereign attempting too much, too quickly, and paying a price considerably beyond simple failure. So what do we actually do? Issei asked. If reinforcement only buys time, and full restoration nearly destroyed an entire coalition 600 years ago, what's actually left? Patience, Yasaka said simply. The same patience that has carried this coalition through every previous challenge. We continue researching, carefully and thoroughly, until we understand considerably more than the bound flame sovereign did before his own fatal attempt. We do not rush toward a solution simply because the problem feels urgent. We build, instead, the kind of careful, comprehensive understanding that gives us the best possible chance of eventually finding a genuinely safe path forward, whenever that path finally reveals itself. Rias, who had remained quiet through much of the final exchange, finally spoke, her expression carrying the particular thoughtfulness she reserved for moments requiring genuine strategic consideration rather than immediate response. I think there's something worth acknowledging here, beyond just the caution this history teaches us. The bound flame sovereign acted alone, or nearly so, drawing on his coalition's strength without, it sounds like, the kind of careful, collaborative deliberation we've built into everything this coalition does now. Every major decision we've made across these past 5 months, the coronation, the reinforcement, even tonight's research, has involved multiple perspectives, multiple sources of caution and expertise working together rather than a single leader's judgment alone. That's a fair distinction, Meihua said, considering the observation carefully. Though I would caution against assuming that structural difference alone guarantees a different outcome. Desperation has a way of eroding careful collaboration just as easily as it erodes individual judgment, if the crisis grows severe enough. I don't disagree, Rias said. I only mean that we have, at minimum, built something considerably more resistant to exactly the kind of isolated, desperate decision-making that doomed the bound flame sovereign's attempt. That seems worth taking some genuine comfort in, even amid everything else this history teaches us to fear. Issei considered her words carefully, turning them over alongside the day's considerable weight of new information. I think that's true, he said finally. I don't think I'd have made it this far, honestly, without exactly the kind of collaboration you're describing. That's not nothing. It might not be enough on its own, but it's not nothing. No, Yasaka agreed, a small, warm smile touching her expression despite the gravity of the conversation. It is, I believe, precisely the foundation this coalition will need most, whenever the path forward finally becomes clear enough to walk. Chapter 3. Life had settled, over the preceding weeks of careful research, into something almost resembling a normal rhythm: school in the mornings, training and coalition business in the afternoons, and evenings spent, more often than not, reviewing whatever the day's archive work had uncovered alongside Yasaka and whichever allies happened to be present. Issei found himself, more than once, grateful for the relative calm, a welcome contrast to the escalating crises that had defined so much of the preceding 5 months. That calm proved short-lived. The careful, patient work of research might have continued undisturbed for considerably longer, had word of the ongoing investigation not, inevitably, begun to spread beyond the small, trusted circle initially involved. Issei learned of the leak from Kuroka, who arrived at the Gremory estate one evening with the same focused urgency that had, on previous occasions, preceded genuinely dangerous news. Someone's been asking questions, she said, without preamble. About the seal, about the research, about all of it. My usual contacts don't know much, which is exactly what worries me. Whoever's asking is being careful, working through channels that don't usually cross paths with my network. That takes resources, and patience, and probably means whoever's behind it already knows more than they should. Any idea who? Rias asked, immediately alert. Not yet, Kuroka admitted. But given the timing, and given how specific the questions apparently are, I'd bet good money it traces back to whatever's left of the old Exorcist network, or possibly something connected to the Ashen Court remnants who never fully reintegrated after their defeat months ago. Either way, someone with a grudge and enough patience to gather real intelligence rather than just striking blindly. How would they even know to look for this in the first place? Issei asked. We've kept the research fairly contained. Gregory scholars, Gremory archives, a handful of trusted clan representatives. That's not exactly a wide circle. That's what worries me most, honestly, Kuroka said. A leak this specific, targeting exactly the right questions rather than just fishing broadly. That usually means someone close to the actual research noticed something they shouldn't have, or talked to the wrong person without realizing it. I'm not accusing anyone specifically, Naya, I just think it's worth considering that whoever's asking these questions might have a more direct connection to your coalition than any of us would like to believe. The suggestion settled uncomfortably over the room, and Rias, her expression carefully neutral despite the clear unease the possibility carried, addressed it directly. We'll need to review who's had access to the research, quietly and carefully, without accusing anyone unfairly before we have real evidence. But you're right to raise it. Better to consider every possibility now than to be blindsided by an answer we should have anticipated. I don't love the idea that someone we trust might have let something slip, Issei admitted. Even accidentally. None of us do, Rias said. But better to face that possibility honestly than to pretend our circle is more secure than the evidence actually suggests. The careful review that followed, conducted quietly over the next 2 days by Rias and Akino working alongside a handful of trusted researchers, eventually traced the leak not to any deliberate betrayal, but to a considerably more mundane source, a junior Gregory researcher who had, in an unguarded moment of professional excitement, discussed elements of the research with a colleague at a neutral scholarly gathering, unaware that the colleague maintained loose, informal ties to individuals connected with the old exorcist network. No malice involved, as far as we can tell, Akino reported, once the investigation concluded. Just careless enthusiasm from someone who didn't fully understand the sensitivity of what they were discussing. Azazel's already addressed it directly with his own staff, and he's assured us it won't happen again. That's somewhat reassuring, at least, Issei said. Better an honest mistake than an actual betrayal. Considerably better, Rias agreed. Though it doesn't change the fact that the information is already out there, circulating through channels we can't fully control at this point. Whatever comes of this leak, we still need to prepare for it seriously. The news settled uncomfortably over the gathered group, and it was Susan, arriving shortly after to review the latest research findings, whose expression tightened with genuine alarm upon hearing the full report. If someone has learned enough to specifically target the seal itself, she said, rather than simply targeting you directly, Issei, that represents a considerably different kind of threat than anything the coalition has faced so far. Deliberately breaking that seal, even with imperfect understanding of what lies beneath it, could prove catastrophic regardless of whoever's intentions in attempting it. Why would anyone want to break it deliberately? Issei asked. Even if they don't fully understand what's actually sealed there, everything we've learned suggests releasing it would be dangerous for everyone, not just us. Desperation does not always calculate risk rationally, Yasaka said grimly. If this traces back to the Ashen Court's more radical remnants, individuals who already demonstrated a willingness to seize power through dangerous, corrupted means during our previous confrontation, it is entirely possible they view an ancient, fractured entity's power as exactly the kind of desperate advantage worth the considerable risk of attempting to seize it. The gravity of that possibility, an enemy willing to deliberately unleash something even Azazel's careful research suggested might prove genuinely catastrophic, settled over the gathered coalition with a weight considerably heavier than any previous threat. We need to secure the veiled threshold properly, Rias said, already turning her considerable strategic mind toward the practical challenge ahead. Not just the careful, quiet reinforcement we managed before, but genuine, sustained protection. If someone's actively planning to exploit that seal's weakness, we can't afford to leave it as lightly guarded as it currently stands. Agreed, Susan said. I will coordinate with the Nine Peaks clan's own considerable defensive resources. Between our combined strength, and whatever additional support the wider coalition can muster on short notice, we should be able to establish protection sufficient to deter all but the most determined, well-prepared assault. Kunou, who had insisted on being present for the planning session despite Yasaka's initial hesitation, spoke up from her usual place near the room's edge, her expression carrying the same solemn determination she'd shown during the earlier discussion about the seal's discovery. I want to help with this too, she said. Not fighting, I know that's not something you'll let me do yet. But I've been practicing with the ward basics Shiro's been teaching me. I could help reinforce the perimeter, even in some small way. Yasaka studied her daughter for a long moment, weighing the request with obvious care. This will be considerably more dangerous than our visit to the seal itself, she said. If the enemy arrives in the strength we're now anticipating, the perimeter will not be a safe place, even for those simply maintaining wards rather than fighting directly. I understand, Kunou said. But I don't want to keep being the one who stays behind while everyone else does the hard, scary parts. I trust Shiro's training. I trust myself to know when to pull back if it gets too dangerous. Shiro, who had been quietly observing the exchange, finally offered her own assessment. She has progressed considerably faster than I expected these past weeks. I would not suggest placing her at the perimeter's most exposed points, but a supporting role, reinforcing wards from a secure position further back, that seems within her current capability, provided proper safeguards remain in place. Yasaka considered this a moment longer before finally nodding, though clear reluctance remained visible beneath her measured agreement. A supporting role only, and you will withdraw the moment I or Shiro instructs you to, without argument. Do you understand? I understand, Kunou said, relief and determination both evident in her expression. Thank you, Mother. Chapter 4. The mobilization that followed occupied the coalition's full attention over the following days, clan representatives from across the growing alliance answering the call with the same steady, committed urgency that had defined every previous crisis. Word reached the underworld as well, Surzex himself sending formal notice that a contingent of devils, volunteered rather than formally dispatched, would stand ready to assist should the coalition's defenses require additional support. My brother wanted me to make clear this isn't the Underworld Council asserting authority over your affairs, Rias explained, relaying the message to the gathered planning session. It's an offer, freely made, in recognition of the partnership we've built since the coronation. Lord Agars, apparently, was among those who insisted the offer be extended, which I confess surprised me almost as much as it surprised my brother. That's a considerable shift from where we started with him, Issei said, genuinely struck by the development. It is, Rias agreed. I think watching you handle every crisis since that first tense council meeting, choosing partnership over unilateral action again and again, has done more to earn his trust than any single grand gesture could have managed. Consistency tends to matter more than spectacle, in the end. This feels like the right moment to finally commit fully, Heian explained, upon her arrival at the gathering staging ground near the valley's outer approach. My clan's elders debated for months whether the old grievances against the domestic clans still mattered enough to keep us apart. Watching how seriously this coalition takes protecting something this ancient and dangerous, rather than simply exploiting it for advantage the way certain remnants apparently intend, made that decision considerably easier to finalize. I'm glad you're here, Issei said, genuinely relieved by the addition of her considerable strength to the gathering defense. Whatever's coming, I think we're going to need every bit of help we can get. Lien arrived shortly after, accompanied by a small delegation from the Gremory Clan carrying specialized defensive artifacts developed specifically for countering corrupted or unstable magic, the same expertise that had proven so valuable during the coronation's earlier defense against the exorcist assault. Matriarch Meihua sends her regrets that clan business prevents her personal attendance, Lien explained, but she has authorized full deployment of whatever resources this defense requires. She was quite clear that protecting this seal takes priority over nearly every other current obligation. Shiro's clan, predictably, arrived with the specialized ward work that had proven essential during every previous confrontation requiring sustained magical defense, Shiro herself overseeing the careful layering of protective barriers around the valley's perimeter with the same meticulous attention she brought to every task involving her clan's particular expertise. I have layered these wards more extensively than anything we managed for the coronation, she told Issei, as the defensive preparations neared completion. If whoever intends to breach the seal arrives with anything less than overwhelming force, I do not believe they will manage to penetrate this perimeter easily. And if they arrive with overwhelming force? Issei asked. Then we will need every ally currently gathered here, and likely considerably more besides, Shiro said honestly. I do not intend to promise certainty where none genuinely exists, Issei. I only intend to ensure our defenses are as strong as careful, thorough preparation can make them. Kuroka, moving through the gathering camp with her usual restless energy, offered her own updated intelligence as the preparations continued. Still working my contacts, but the picture's getting clearer, she reported. Whoever's behind this, they're moving faster than I initially expected. My best guess now puts their approach within the next 2 days, maybe sooner. Then we make sure we're ready before they arrive, Rias said, her strategic focus sharpening as the timeline compressed. Kiba, Kaneko, I want the perimeter's most vulnerable approaches identified and reinforced specifically. Akino, coordinate with Shiro's ward work to make sure our combat response and the defensive magic work together seamlessly rather than at cross purposes. Hozuki, overseeing the Inari delegation's own defensive positioning nearby, approached Issei as the day's preparations wound toward evening, his usual easy friendliness tempered by the seriousness of the coming confrontation. My father wanted me to relay something, he said. He remembers what it was to be skeptical of you, back when this all began. He asked me to tell you that watching the coalition rally this thoroughly, this quickly, in defense of something none of us fully understand, has done more to settle his last remaining doubts than anything else across these past months. That means a lot, Issei said. Please thank him for me. I will, Hozuki said, then hesitated a moment before continuing. For what it's worth, I meant what I told you after the coronation, about how far you've come since that first nervous street corner conversation. Whatever happens tomorrow, or whenever this attack actually arrives, I don't think anyone gathered here doubts that you'll meet it the same honest way you've met everything else. I hope you're right, Issei said, managing a tired smile despite the mounting tension of the coming confrontation. That evening, as the gathered coalition settled into whatever rest the uncertain timeline allowed, Issei found himself walking the valley's outer perimeter alone, checking the layered wards and quiet, watchful defenders one final time before attempting his own rest. He found Rias waiting near the perimeter's edge, apparently having anticipated exactly where his restless energy would eventually lead him. Couldn't sleep either? She asked. Not really, Issei admitted, settling beside her. Too much running through my head. The bound flame sovereign story, what happens if we can't hold the perimeter, whether Kunou's really ready for even the limited role Yasaka agreed to. All reasonable things to worry about, Rias said. But you've faced uncertainty like this before, more times than either of us probably wants to count at this point. I don't think tomorrow is going to be any different, even if the stakes feel considerably larger than usual. I know, Issei said. It just feels different somehow. Everything else, we knew roughly what we were facing. This time, I'm not sure any of us actually know what happens if that seal breaks. Then we make sure it doesn't, Rias said simply. That's the whole point of everything we've spent the past several days preparing. You're not facing this alone, Issei. None of us are facing it alone. That's been true since the very beginning, and I don't see any reason it's going to stop being true tomorrow. Akino found them a while later, having apparently noticed their absence, and followed a similar restless instinct out to the perimeter's edge. I thought I might find you two out here, she said, settling nearby with a small, knowing smile despite the evening's considerable tension. Neither of you are particularly good at pretending to sleep when something this large is weighing on you. Guilty, Issei admitted, managing a tired laugh. For what it's worth, Akino said, her usual playful tone giving way to something more genuinely reassuring. I've watched this coalition prepare for danger more times now than I can easily count, and I don't think I've ever seen the defenses laid out quite this thoroughly. Whatever comes tomorrow, I think we've done everything reasonably possible to meet it well. I hope you're right, Issei said. I usually am, about these things, Akino said, with just enough teasing warmth to draw a genuine smile from him despite the lingering tension. Get some rest if you can manage it. Tomorrow will need you at your best, and worrying yourself sleepless tonight won't actually help anyone. The 2 days that followed passed in a blur of careful, focused preparation, the gathered coalition's considerable combined strength organizing itself into a defense more thorough and coordinated than anything the Alliance had assembled even for the coronation's own defense months earlier. Every lesson learned across 5 months of escalating challenges finally converging into a single, unified effort to protect something none of them fully understood, but all of them recognized as genuinely, considerably important to protect. Chapter 5. The attack, when it finally arrived on the evening of the second day, came with a coordinated precision that immediately confirmed Kuroka's assessment of a patient, well-prepared enemy rather than a desperate, disorganized one. Issei felt the disturbance first, a sharp, sudden pressure against the valley's outer wards, and within moments the gathered defenders were moving into their carefully rehearsed positions as the first wave of attackers emerged from the surrounding mist. At their head walked a figure Issei recognized immediately, despite the months since their last encounter, the same gaunt intensity, though augmented now with something considerably more unstable than even the corrupted spirit magic that had powered the Ashen Court's earlier resurgence. You, Issei said, recognizing the original Ashen Court leader, the man he defeated months earlier at the abandoned shrine complex, now radiating a wrongness that made even that earlier corrupted power feel comparatively contained. Me, the man confirmed, something manic and desperate flickering behind his eyes. I told you, Sovereign, that our defeat was not the end of the old order's resistance. I have spent these months since gathering considerably more than the scattered remnants you so easily dismissed before. I know what rests beneath that valley now. I know what it could grant someone willing to seize it properly, rather than simply containing it out of misguided caution. You don't understand what you're trying to release, Issei said, aware of the coalition's defensive lines solidifying around him as the wider battle began erupting across the valley's perimeter. It's not a weapon. It's not something you can just seize and control. I understand considerably more than you give me credit for, the man said. I understand that an incomplete, fractured power, desperate to reclaim what it lost, might prove remarkably willing to grant considerable strength to whoever offers to help it do exactly that. The implications of that statement settled with cold, immediate dread, and Issei realized, with a sinking certainty, exactly what the man intended, not simply to break the seal for the sake of chaos, but to actively bargain with whatever fractured consciousness remained trapped within it, offering himself as a vessel or ally in exchange for a share of its power. That's not a bargain, Issei said. That's exactly what Susan's records warned us about. Something in genuine, desperate pain doesn't make careful, reasonable deals. It just takes whatever it can reach. Then I'll take that risk, the man said, and surged forward with a speed and ferocity that immediately confirmed just how much more dangerous he'd become since their previous encounter. Elsewhere along the perimeter, Kiba met the first wave of coordinated attackers with the same precise, practiced skill that had carried him through every previous confrontation, his blades finding gaps in the enemy's formation with an efficiency that spoke to months of continuous refinement since their earliest battles together. Kaneko fought beside him, her enhanced strength anchoring the perimeter's most physically demanding point, shattering through attackers who mistook her smaller stature for vulnerability rather than the considerable, understated power it actually represented. They're testing the same weak point repeatedly, Kiba called out, deflecting another coordinated strike. I don't think this is random. Someone's directing this from further back. Then let's make sure that weak point stops being weak, Kaneko said, planting herself more firmly at the contested position, and the two of them settled into the same practiced, wordless coordination that had defined their partnership since long before any Kitsune bloodline had entered their lives. The battle that followed tested every layer of the coalition's careful preparation, Shiro's extensive wards flaring repeatedly to intercept attackers attempting to breach the perimeter at multiple coordinated points simultaneously, Heian's considerable strength anchoring one flank alongside Lien's specialized countermeasures against the augmented, unstable magic several of the attackers carried. Kuroka and Ryasa's peerage meeting wave after wave of coordinated assault with the same practice. Hard-won coordination that had carried them through every previous crisis. Kunou, positioned exactly where Yasaka and Shiro had agreed, well back from the perimeter's most exposed points, focused with fierce, determined concentration on reinforcing a section of ward that had begun flickering under sustained pressure from a coordinated group of attackers. Her single tail flared with effort, considerably less power than her mother's own considerable wards could produce, but enough, combined with Shiro's own reinforcement, to hold the section steady through several dangerous minutes. You're doing well, Shiro called out, even as she maintained her own considerable effort nearby. Keep that focus steady. I'm trying, Kunou called back, strain evident in her young voice despite her determined effort. It's harder than practice made it feel. Everything real is, Shiro said, offering what encouragement she could spare amid her own sustained concentration. You are doing exactly what you promised your mother you would do. That is enough. Elsewhere along the perimeter, Heian's autumn red tails wove through a cluster of attackers with practiced, considerable force, her earlier wry demeanor entirely replaced by focused, decisive intensity. This is exactly the kind of fight I told my clan's elders we should be ready for, she called out to Lien, fighting nearby. Glad we didn't wait any longer to commit properly. Agreed, Lien said, her own countermeasures disrupting another attacker's unstable magic with practiced precision. Though I could have done without quite this much excitement on what was supposed to be a careful defensive posting. Issei himself faced the leader directly, the exchange between them considerably more dangerous than their first confrontation months earlier, the leader's augmented strength now carrying an unstable, desperate edge that made every strike unpredictable in ways Issei's considerable training struggled to fully anticipate. Whatever's happened to you since we last fought, Issei said, meeting a wild, desperate strike with the full, controlled weight of his coronated bloodline, it's not making you stronger. It's just making you more willing to burn yourself out trying to prove a point that was never actually true. You keep saying that, the leader spat, pressing forward with reckless, unstable ferocity. As though understanding my own desperation somehow makes it less real, or less worth acting on. I'm not saying it isn't real, Issei said, deflecting another wild strike with careful, controlled precision. I'm saying it's leading you somewhere that's going to hurt a lot more people than just you, if I let it. You keep talking like you actually understand what it's like, the leader said, pressing forward with another wild, desperate combination that Issei met carefully, deflecting each strike with the accumulated strength of his coronated bloodline rather than meeting force with matching force. Being cast aside. Watching clans decide, without ever really knowing you, that your bloodline made you less worth trusting. I don't understand it the same way you do, Issei admitted, aware even amid the battle's chaos that honesty remained his most reliable tool, exactly as it always had. But I've watched people I care about get hurt by exactly that kind of unfairness. I've spent months trying to fix pieces of it, one clan at a time. That's not the same as living it yourself, I know that. But it's not nothing either. It's not enough, the leader said, though something in his voice, beneath the desperate ferocity, carried a note that sounded almost like genuine, exhausted grief rather than pure conviction. Maybe not yet, Issei said. But breaking that seal isn't going to fix what actually happened to you. It's just going to give you a different kind of pain to carry, on top of everything you're already carrying. The exchange continued, each strike testing Issei's considerable training against the leader's increasingly desperate, unpredictable assault, the wider battle raging around them as the coalition's careful, layered defense continued holding against wave after wave of coordinated pressure. Chapter 6. The exchange reached its climax as the leader, sensing his augmented strength beginning to falter under the sustained pressure of Issei's controlled, considerable power, made a desperate final push toward the seal itself, clearly intending to force whatever confrontation or bargain he'd planned regardless of the battle's clearly shifting balance. Stop him, Rias called out, already moving to intercept, but the leader's desperate speed carried him past her guard, close enough to the ancient stone that Issei felt, with sudden, sharp clarity, the seal's fragile, weakened structure respond to his proximity, cracks that had only recently been carefully reinforced beginning to strain visibly under the pressure of his approaching, unstable power. Issei moved without conscious calculation, the full weight of his bonded coalition's strength answering the desperate need of the moment exactly as it had answered every previous crisis since a ruined gymnasium had first cracked open this ancient bloodline, closing the distance in a single, controlled burst of golden fire that intercepted the leader mere feet from the seal's ancient surface. You don't get to make this choice for everyone else, Issei said, the accumulated strength of dozens of bonded clans lending his voice a weight and certainty that carried clearly across the battle's chaos. Whatever pain you're carrying, whatever made you believe this was worth the risk, it's not worth what breaking that seal would actually cost. The final exchange lasted only seconds, the leader's desperate, unstable strength finally collapsing under the combined weight of Issei's controlled power and the accumulated exhaustion of a battle he'd clearly underestimated the coalition's readiness to meet. He crumbled to the ground, unconscious but alive, exactly as Issei had ensured in every previous confrontation, and across the valley's wider perimeter, the remaining attackers, recognizing their leader's defeat, began a swift, disorganized retreat that the coalition's defenders, exhausted but victorious, allowed to proceed without pursuit. As the immediate danger passed, Issei found himself kneeling beside the seal, checking carefully for any lasting damage from the leader's desperate final approach, and felt, with quiet relief, that the ancient stone structure, while clearly strained, had held. It's stable, he reported, as Susan arrived to conduct her own careful assessment, the 9 Peaks elder running her experienced evaluation over the seal's weathered surface. Strained, but stable, Susan confirmed. We will need to reinforce it again, more thoroughly this time, but the immediate crisis has passed. Yasaka arrived moments later, having crossed the battlefield with visible urgency the moment the fighting had concluded, her attention immediately searching out her daughter rather than the seal itself. She found Kunou still positioned at her assigned point, exhausted but unharmed, and the relief that crossed her expression was immediate and unguarded in a way Issei had rarely seen from her. You held your position, Yasaka said, kneeling to check her daughter over with careful, thorough attention despite Kunou's evident lack of injury. Exactly as you promised. I told you I could, Kunou said, though her voice carried more exhaustion than her usual confident bravado typically allowed. It was scary, though. More than I expected, even knowing it might be. That is an honest and appropriate thing to feel, Yasaka said, pulling her daughter into a brief, fierce embrace before releasing her. I am proud of you, Kunou. More than I know how to properly express right now. Issei, watching the exchange from a short distance, felt something warm settle in his chest despite the day's considerable exhaustion, one more small proof of exactly how much this coalition had grown to mean to everyone within it, not simply a political alliance, but something considerably closer to family. The captured leader, secured under careful guard as the coalition's defenders began the slow work of standing down, offered no further resistance, his earlier desperate intensity having collapsed into something closer to hollow exhaustion once his augmented strength finally gave out entirely. Issei approached him briefly before the man was taken into more formal custody, unable to simply walk away without at least attempting to understand what had driven him back into conflict after their first confrontation months earlier. Why keep trying? Issei asked. After the first defeat, after everything that happened to the Ashen Court. You could have walked away. The man studied him with tired, hollow eyes before answering. Because walking away would have meant admitting everything I believed was wrong from the start. That the clans really were as unfair as I always claimed, and that fighting back, even through means I knew were dangerous, was still better than simply accepting the unfairness quietly. He paused, something almost like genuine regret flickering behind his exhaustion. I don't know if I still believe that, honestly. Not after tonight. Watching your coalition hold together the way it did, watching people actually choose to stand beside each other instead of just calculating advantage, that's not the picture of the clans I'd built my entire cause around resenting. It's not too late to choose something different, Issei said. I meant that the first time we fought, and I still mean it now. The man didn't answer immediately, but something in his exhausted expression suggested, for the first time, genuine consideration rather than reflexive defiance, and Issei found himself, watching the guards lead him away, hoping, despite everything the man had cost the coalition across 2 separate confrontations, that some version of that consideration might eventually take root. Azazel himself arrived not long after, having apparently kept close enough tabs on the unfolding situation to make the journey the moment word reached him of the attack's conclusion, his usual casual demeanor tempered by genuine concern as he took in the battle's considerable aftermath. I came as soon as I heard, he said, finding Issei near the seal's edge. Glad to see you're standing, at least. I take it the information leak traced back to my staff played some role in tonight's timing. It did, Issei confirmed, though without any real accusation in his tone. But it wasn't malicious. Just an honest mistake that got picked up by the wrong ears. That doesn't make it any less my responsibility to address properly, Azazel said, his expression carrying genuine, unguarded regret. I've already tightened the research protocols considerably, and I intend to personally oversee anything sensitive going forward, rather than delegating quite so freely. You have my word this particular mistake won't repeat itself. I appreciate that, Issei said. I don't think anyone here blames your staff for an honest slip. It's just a reminder that this whole situation is bigger and more dangerous than any of us fully accounted for, even with all the careful planning. An accurate assessment, unfortunately, Azazel said, studying the strained but stable seal with the same rigorous, careful attention he brought to every piece of genuine scholarly interest. For what it's worth, tonight's confrontation has actually given me considerably more to work with, in terms of understanding the fragment's actual nature. The leader's stated intention, to bargain with it directly rather than simply seize its power by force, that's new information, and potentially useful. It suggests the fragment retains enough coherent consciousness to actually negotiate, which is either deeply concerning or, depending on how you look at it, cautiously promising. Promising how? Issei asked. Something capable of negotiation is, at least theoretically, something capable of being reasoned with eventually, Azazel said. Whether that reasoning ever proves safe or practical to attempt, I genuinely don't know yet. But it's a different kind of problem than pure, unreasoning hunger would represent. That distinction matters considerably, for whatever solution we eventually pursue. Rias found him a short while later, exhaustion evident in both their expressions despite the relief of the battle's successful conclusion. That was close, she said quietly. Closer than I'd like to admit, honestly. Too close, Issei agreed. If Shiro's wards hadn't held as well as they did, if everyone hadn't been positioned exactly where they needed to be, I don't know what would have happened if he'd actually reached that seal directly. But they did hold, Rias said. And everyone was exactly where they needed to be. That's not luck, Issei. That's 5 months of careful, patient work finally proving its worth in exactly the moment it mattered most. As the coalition began the slow, careful process of standing down from full defensive readiness, tending to the battle's various injuries and beginning preparations for the more thorough reinforcement Susan had indicated the seal would require, Issei found himself, once again, surrounded by the steadily growing family of allies who had chosen, through danger after danger, to stand beside him. Heian approached as the immediate aftermath settled into quieter, more exhausted relief, her earlier wry curiosity long since replaced by the steady, committed presence of someone who had, this evening, formally proven her clan's alliance through action rather than mere word. The Biko line will remain, she said simply. Whatever comes next, however this ancient, fractured business eventually resolves, you'll have our strength standing beside you. Thank you, Issei said, genuinely moved. For everything, but especially for choosing to stand here tonight, when the danger was still entirely uncertain. That, Heian said, a small, tired smile touching her expression, is rather the point of choosing an alliance, Sovereign. The uncertain, dangerous nights are exactly when it matters most. Kuroka found him shortly after, her usual lazy grin returning despite the evening's considerable exhaustion, though something warmer lingered beneath it, as it so often did after the coalition weathered another genuine crisis together. Not bad for a defense thrown together in 2 days, she said. Told you my contacts were worth trusting, even when the news is bad, Naya. You did, Issei agreed, managing a tired laugh. Thank you for the warning, and for fighting tonight, same as always. Wouldn't have missed it, Kuroka said, settling beside him with easy familiarity. Though I wouldn't mind a considerably quieter week or two before the next crisis comes knocking, if the universe happens to be listening. Lien and Shiro joined the gathering shortly after, both carrying the particular exhausted satisfaction of allies who had proven their considerable worth once again, and the small, informal circle that formed near the seal's edge as the night deepened carried the same warm, hard-won camaraderie that had defined so many of the coalition's quieter moments across the preceding months. Even amid the lingering tension of the evening's genuine danger, Kunou found her way into the circle as well, still exhausted from her own considerable effort at the perimeter's wards, settling close beside her mother with the particular contentment of someone who had proven something significant to herself that evening. I held it, she said, mostly to herself, though loud enough for the gathered circle to hear. The whole time. I didn't need to pull back once. You did more than hold it, Shiro said, offering the rare praise with genuine warmth. You reinforced a section of ward under sustained, coordinated pressure, at your age, with only a fraction of the training most kitsune your age would have received. That is not a small accomplishment, Kunou. I want to do more next time, Kunou said, though a wide yawn undercut some of the declaration's intended force. There will be time enough for more, as you continue growing into your strength, Yasaka said, settling an affectionate hand over her daughter's head. Tonight you have earned considerable rest, same as everyone else gathered here. Lien, watching the warm, easy exchange with a thoughtful expression, finally spoke, her earlier careful reserve from their very first meeting months ago entirely absent now. I find myself, watching evenings like this one, increasingly grateful that matriarch Meihua chose curiosity over continued isolation, all those months ago. I do not think I properly understood, before joining this coalition, how much difference genuine trust actually makes, compared to simple political convenience. Neither did I, honestly, Issei admitted. Not until I actually started living it, one honest conversation at a time. The circle settled into comfortable, easy quiet after that, exhaustion and relief mingling into the particular contentment that came only after genuine danger had been faced and once again, successfully overcome together, and Issei found himself, watching the gathered faces around him, struck by how naturally this had all come to feel, family built not from obligation or bloodline alone, but from choice. Renewed again and again across every crisis this journey had demanded of them. As night fully settled over the valley, the last of the defensive preparations giving way to the quiet, careful work of tending wounds and beginning the coalition's next phase of research and reinforcement, Issei found a quiet moment to simply breathe, watching the mist-shrouded stone that had, across the preceding weeks, come to represent both the coalition's greatest unresolved mystery and its most important shared responsibility. Whatever the fractured entity sleeping beneath that ancient seal eventually proved to be, whatever path forward the coalition's careful, patient research eventually revealed, Issei understood now, with a certainty earned through 5 months of accumulated trials and steadily deepening trust, that he would not be facing whatever came next without the considerable, hard-won strength of allies who had proven, again and again, exactly how much they were willing to risk standing beside him. Act 7, Chapter 1. The captured leader, held under careful but not unkind guard in a secured section of Yasaka's own territory, requested to speak with Issei directly 3 days after the battle at the Veiled Threshold, a request that arrived through one of the guards with evident surprise, given how little the man had spoken since his capture. Issei spent much of those 3 days turning over the exchange they'd shared mid-battle, the leader's exhausted, grief-tinged words lingering with a weight that felt different from the straightforward relief of simple victory. He found himself, more than once, wondering whether the coalition's approach to Tetsuya's continued custody, careful but not punitive, reflected exactly the kind of considered judgment Yasaka had always encouraged, or whether it represented a risk none of them had fully reckoned with yet. His name is Tetsuya, Yasaka said, relaying the request to Issei later that evening. He gave it freely, when asked, which I confess surprised the guards considerably. He has said little else since, only that he wishes to speak with you directly, and only you. Do you think it's safe? Rias asked, her protective instincts immediately engaged. I believe so, Yasaka said. He is closely watched, and whatever augmented strength he carried into battle has been considerably diminished by the corrupted magic's toll on his own body. I do not believe he currently poses much physical threat. Whether his intentions are trustworthy is a separate question entirely, one only Issei can properly judge for himself. Issei found Tetsuya in a plain, secured room the following morning, the man looking considerably smaller and more exhausted than he had during either of their 2 confrontations. Whatever desperate, manic intensity had driven him now replaced by a hollow, careful stillness. Thank you for coming, Tetsuya said, once the guards had withdrawn to a respectful distance, close enough to intervene if necessary but far enough to allow genuine conversation. I wasn't certain you would. You asked to talk, Issei said, taking a seat across from him. I meant what I said during the fight. It's not too late to choose something different. I've been thinking about that, Tetsuya admitted. More than I expected to, honestly, given how thoroughly I convinced myself these past months that my path was the only reasonable response to how the clans treated people like me. Watching your coalition hold together the way it did, watching people who barely knew each other months ago fight and bleed for something they believed in together, that shook something loose in me that I hadn't examined properly in a very long time. What made you finally reach out to talk? Issei asked. Tetsuya considered the question carefully before answering. Partly guilt, if I'm honest. Partly something else, though. I want to tell you something I haven't told your guards, information I think you genuinely need to know, regardless of what happens to me afterward. I'm listening, Issei said, aware of the careful weight in the man's tone. The corrupted spirit magic I carried into that second battle, Tetsuya said, I didn't source that myself. Someone provided it, along with detailed information about the seal's location and vulnerabilities, information I couldn't have gathered on my own, not with the resources the Ashen Court had left after our first defeat. I assumed, at the time, it was simply an opportunistic ally, someone with their own grudge against the clans willing to supply resources in exchange for chaos. I'm considerably less certain of that now, looking back. Why less certain? Issei asked, leaning forward with focused attention. Because the information was too specific, Tetsuya said. Details about the seal's exact structure, about the fractured entity's nature, about the bound flame sovereign's failed attempt centuries ago. That's not information a random opportunist should have had access to. That's the kind of information that suggests someone with genuine, considerable historical knowledge, possibly someone who's been tracking this seal's condition for far longer than any of us realized. The revelation settled uncomfortably over Issei, an unwelcome new thread of concern layering atop everything the coalition had already been carefully managing. Do you have any idea who this person actually was? Only a voice, Tetsuya admitted. Communications through intermediaries, never direct contact. But there was one detail, one thing the voice said during our final exchange before the attack, that's stayed with me since. They said the seal wasn't the only one. That there were others, scattered across the world, and that whoever managed to break even one properly would have more leverage than any single faction currently understands. Did they say anything else? About what they actually wanted, or why they were helping the Ashen Court specifically? Issei asked, aware of how much might hinge on whatever fragments of memory Tetsuya could still offer. Tetsuya considered the question carefully, visibly working to recall details he had likely spent considerable effort trying to forget in the aftermath of his defeat. They never explained their own motives directly. Only ever framed things in terms of what I wanted, what the Ashen Court wanted, always careful to make it feel like my own cause rather than someone else's agenda. Looking back, that pattern feels considerably more calculated than I appreciated at the time. I was desperate enough, and angry enough, that I didn't stop to question why a stranger's goals happened to align so conveniently with my own. That's a familiar kind of manipulation, Issei said quietly, thinking of every desperate, cornered choice this entire journey had shown him. The bound flame sovereign's own centuries-old desperation not so different, in its own way, from whatever had driven Tetsuya toward the same dangerous edge. I know that now, Tetsuya said. It doesn't undo what I did. But I wanted you to have this information regardless, because whatever's actually coordinating this, it's considerably larger than my own grievances against the clans ever were. I'd rather see it stopped properly than let my own stubborn pride keep useful information to myself out of some misplaced sense of defiance. Thank you, Issei said. For telling me. I mean that. I don't expect it to change what happens to me, Tetsuya said. I understand there will be consequences for everything I've done. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just didn't want to be the reason something worse happened to people who never did anything to deserve it. Issei left the meeting turning the revelation over carefully, and found the rest of the peerage waiting with obvious curiosity once he returned to the clubroom later that evening. He relayed the conversation in full, watching their reactions settle into the same careful, sobering weight that had accompanied every previous escalation of this expanding mystery. Other seals, Kiba said slowly. That's considerably bigger than anything we originally understood this to be. It changes the shape of the problem entirely, Rias agreed. We're not just protecting one ancient, fractured fragment anymore. If Tetsuya's information holds true, we might be looking at a coordinated effort spanning multiple traditions, multiple regions, possibly multiple centuries of patient planning. Do you believe him? Kaneko asked, her usual quiet directness cutting straight to the heart of the matter. That he's actually trying to help now, instead of just saying whatever gets him the most lenient treatment. Issei considered the question carefully before answering. I think so. I don't think someone fakes that particular kind of exhaustion, or that particular kind of regret. But I also think we should verify whatever he told us as carefully as we can, rather than just taking it at face value because it's convenient to believe. That seems wise, Rias said. Careful verification alongside genuine compassion. That's rather become the Coalition's whole approach to everything, hasn't it? What happens to him now? Asia asked quietly, her gentle concern extending even towards someone who had, only weeks earlier, posed genuine danger to everyone she cared about. Tetsuya, I mean. Does giving us this information change anything for him? I think it should, Issei said, considering the question carefully. Not erase what he did, but I don't think continued imprisonment is really what any of this coalition is trying to build either. I'd like to talk to Yasaka and Susan about whether there's a path toward him actually contributing something constructive, instead of just sitting in custody indefinitely. That seems like exactly the kind of risk worth taking carefully, Rias said, provided it comes with appropriate safeguards. I don't think anyone here doubts your instinct to offer people a genuine path forward, Issei. I only want to make sure we don't repeat any mistakes in how quickly we extend that trust. Agreed, Issei said. Slow and careful. But I don't want to just leave him to rot somewhere either, not after what he told us today. The conversation settled into quieter, more thoughtful territory after that, the peerage turning over the day's revelations with the same careful, considered attention that had carried the coalition through every previous escalation, and Issei found himself, watching the familiar, comfortable gathering around him, grateful once again for exactly the kind of steady, grounding presence that made even the most unsettling news feel considerably more manageable to carry. Chapter 2. The implications of Tetsuya's revelation occupied the coalition's attention for days afterward, Yasaka, Susan, and Meihua gathering repeatedly to weigh what this new, unsettling possibility might mean for everything they had learned so far about the ancient, fractured entity and its scattered guardianship. Other seals, Susan said during one such gathering, her expression carrying the particular gravity she reserved for genuinely significant revelations. If true, that would explain a detail in the old records I confess I never properly understood, references to the veiled threshold as one among several, rather than a singular, unique location. It would also mean, Meihua added, that whoever is coordinating this effort against you, Issei, possesses knowledge and reach considerably beyond a single rogue faction's typical capability. Tracking multiple seals across different regions, different pantheons even, that requires resources and patience that suggests something considerably larger than the Ashen Court's remnants alone. Azazel, consulted shortly after via a hastily arranged meeting at the Gregory, confirmed the unsettling possibility with characteristic bluntness. It actually aligns with something I'd wondered about myself, digging through the older records, he said. References to the root, or the first flame, occasionally mention plural containments, rather than a single site. I'd assumed, honestly, that this was simply inconsistent translation across different fragmentary sources. If Tetsuya's information holds true, it suggests those plural references were accurate all along, and that whoever fractured further, if such a thing happened, scattered guardianship across multiple traditions entirely. Does the Yokai clan's own tradition mention anything about other seals specifically? Rias asked, turning her attention toward Meihua with careful, strategic interest. Meihua considered the question thoughtfully before answering. Our fragmentary legends mention guardianship maintained at the world's edges, plural in form even in our own oldest records, though I confess I always assumed that plurality referred simply to different generations of guardians rather than genuinely separate locations. I will have my clan's own archivists review those records again, with this new possibility specifically in mind. It's entirely possible we've been sitting on relevant information without recognizing its full significance. That would be enormously helpful, Issei said. At this point, I think every fragment of information we can gather matters considerably more than any of us initially appreciated. Agreed, Meihua said. I will have preliminary findings within the week, though I caution against expecting anything definitive. Our own archives, like Kyoto's, have accumulated centuries of fragmentary, sometimes contradictory information. Extracting genuine clarity from that accumulated weight takes time, even with considerable motivation to move quickly. It was that same week, during a quiet evening in the training clearing, that Issei experienced the first of what would become a recurring, unsettling pattern, a dream unlike any he'd had before, vivid and strange in ways that felt considerably more significant than ordinary sleep. In the dream, he stood within the mist-shrouded valley of the veiled threshold, though the seal itself appeared different, cracked open just slightly, golden light spilling from within in slow, pulsing waves. A presence, formless but unmistakably aware, seemed to press against the edges of his consciousness, not hostile exactly, but heavy with something that felt uncomfortably close to grief. You carry pieces of me, the presence seemed to communicate, though not in words exactly, more in impression, a feeling translated imperfectly into something his waking mind could later recall. Both pieces. The fire and the flame. I have waited so long to feel them whole again, even briefly, even through a vessel not truly mine. Issei woke abruptly, heart pounding, the dream strange, heavy weight lingering uncomfortably even as the familiar surroundings of his own room reasserted themselves around him. You look unsettled, Yasaka observed, the following morning, when Issei relayed the dream during their usual training session. Has this happened before? Never like this, Issei admitted. It didn't feel like an ordinary dream. It felt like something was actually reaching out, somehow. Drake, stirring within Issei's mind with evident concern, offered his own careful assessment. It is possible, partner, that the reinforcement work you performed at the seal created a kind of connection, however faint, between your bloodline and whatever consciousness remains trapped within that stone. I have never encountered anything quite like this myself, but the theory would align with everything Azazel and Yasaka have described about the fragment's nature. Have you sensed anything through the connection yourself? Issei asked. Since you're carrying part of whatever this fragment used to be too. Only an echo, Drake said, after a moment's careful consideration. Fainter than what you describe experiencing directly, more a pressure at the edge of my own awareness than anything resembling clear communication. I suspect the connection runs primarily through the Kitsune aspect of your bloodline, given how the dreams seem to center on that particular fire and flame the presence described. That does not mean the draconic aspect remains entirely untouched, only that whatever reaches toward you does so through the channel it apparently recognizes most clearly. Do you think that matters? Which part of me it's actually reaching toward? Perhaps, Drake said. If this fragmented entity retains enough coherent memory to distinguish between the aspects of itself now scattered across your bloodline, that suggests a mind considerably more intact than simple, mindless hunger would produce. I find that observation, cautiously, more reassuring than concerning, though I would not yet call it comfortable. If it's actually reaching out, Rias said, once the full coalition had gathered to discuss the development, what does that mean? Is it dangerous? Could it try to use that connection against you somehow? I don't know, Issei admitted honestly. It didn't feel dangerous, exactly. It felt sad, mostly. Lonely, maybe? But I don't know if that's actually what it is, or just what it wants me to feel. Asia, listening with the same quiet, attentive concern she brought to every difficult conversation, offered her own thoughtful perspective. Maybe it's both, she said. Something can be genuinely lonely and still be dangerous, if it's desperate enough. I don't think those things cancel each other out. That's fair, Issei admitted. I guess I just don't know how to hold both of those at once yet. Feeling for something, while also staying careful around it. You've done exactly that before, Rias reminded him. With Tetsuya, even before he came around to talking with you honestly. You never stopped being careful. But you also never stopped treating him like someone capable of choosing something better. I don't see why this should be any different, even if the stakes feel considerably larger. The dream returned twice more over the following 2 weeks, never with any dramatically new information, but each time reinforcing the same heavy, grieving impression, fragments of longing translated imperfectly through whatever thin, unintended connection the reinforcement ritual had apparently opened. Kunou, upon learning of the dreams during one of her regular visits to the training clearing, listened with unusually serious attention for someone her age. Does it scare you? She asked, settling beside him with none of her usual restless energy. The dreams, I mean. A little, Issei admitted honestly, unwilling to offer her anything less than the truth she'd always valued from him. Not because I think it's going to hurt me. More because I don't know what it means long term. Whether this connection is something I should be worried about, or something that might actually help us understand the fragment better. Maybe it's both, Kunou said, echoing Asia's earlier observation with the same blunt, unadorned clarity she brought to most difficult questions. Mother says the things worth understanding are usually a little scary, right up until you actually understand them properly. Your mother has a lot of good sayings, Issei said, managing a tired smile despite the lingering unease the dreams continued to stir. She does, Kunou agreed, entirely without irony. I'm going to remember all of them, eventually. For when I'm the one giving advice to people someday. Chapter 3. The dreams continued intermittently over the following weeks, never quite repeating the same imagery, but always carrying the same heavy, grieving weight, fragments of impression rather than clear communication, glimpses of something ancient and fractured reaching, however imperfectly, toward a connection it had apparently been denied for centuries. Issei learned, gradually, to recognize the dreams for what they likely were, not immediate danger, but a genuine, if unsettling, form of contact that Azazel's research suggested might actually prove valuable, provided it could be properly understood rather than either dismissed or blindly trusted. It was during this same uncertain period that unexpected word arrived from considerably further afield than any previous coalition contact. A formal request for audience delivered through diplomatic channels Issei hadn't even known existed, originating from a delegation representing the Norse pantheon's considerable interests. Odin's court does not typically involve itself in matters outside Norse territory, Azazel explained, when the request reached him for verification before being forwarded to Issei's coalition. If they're reaching out specifically regarding your situation, that suggests they've either heard about the seal through their own channels, or, more concerning, that they have direct knowledge relevant to what you're currently investigating. Do you know much about how they typically operate diplomatically? Rias asked, already turning her considerable strategic attention toward preparing for an unfamiliar cultural context. I'd rather not repeat the same missteps we nearly made with the Underworld Council, back when this all started. Norse diplomatic custom tends toward directness, more so than either the Underworld's careful formality or the Kitsune clan's layered ceremony, Azazel said. Blunt honesty is generally valued over polished diplomatic language, provided that honesty comes wrapped in appropriate respect. I suspect, given everything I've observed about your particular approach these past months, Issei, you may actually find this meeting considerably more comfortable than some of your earlier diplomatic encounters. That's oddly reassuring, Issei admitted, managing a tired laugh despite the day's mounting uncertainty. I've never been especially good at the careful, layered kind of diplomacy anyway. No, Azazel agreed, with clear amusement, you have not. Which is, I suspect, exactly why this particular meeting may go rather better than you're currently anticipating. The delegation, when it finally arrived at a carefully arranged neutral meeting ground, consisted of a single figure, a tall, pale-haired woman whose bearing carried the same unmistakable weight of considerable age and power Issei had grown accustomed to recognizing among the Kitsune clan elders, though her presence carried a colder, sharper edge entirely distinct from Yasaka's warm authority or Susan's careful stillness. I am Solveig, she said, by way of introduction, her Japanese precise though carrying a distinct accent. Seer and guardian, in service to Odin's court, though I come today on my own initiative rather than formal Norse mandate. I have followed reports of your situation with considerable interest, Sovereign, given certain parallels to matters my own tradition has quietly guarded for centuries. Parallels to what, exactly? Issei asked. To a seal of our own, Solveig said, maintained at the roots of what our tradition calls the World Tree, protecting a fragment of ancient, fractured power that our oldest records describe in terms remarkably similar to what I understand your own coalition has recently uncovered regarding the entity you call the Root. The revelation confirmed, with unsettling clarity, exactly what Tetsuya's warning had suggested, and the gathered coalition absorbed the news with the particular gravity that had accompanied every previous major escalation of this ancient, sprawling mystery. How long has your tradition known about this connection? Yasaka asked, her own considerable historical knowledge clearly working to reconcile this new information against everything the Kitsune clans had independently pieced together. Centuries, Solveig admitted. Though we, like you, apparently, only ever understood our own seal in isolation, never connecting it to similar guardianship maintained by other traditions across the world. It was only recently, when disturbing reports reached us of unusual activity near our own seal's location, unauthorized individuals attempting careful, probing reconnaissance similar to what you describe experiencing before the attack at your own veiled threshold, that I began investigating more broadly, and eventually found reports of your situation. You think the same person is targeting your seal too, Issei said, the pieces settling into an increasingly concerning shape. I believe it is a strong possibility, Solveig said. And I believe, given the stakes involved should multiple seals face coordinated pressure simultaneously, that our respective traditions would be considerably better served working together than continuing to guard our separate mysteries in isolation. Yasaka studied the Norse guardian with careful, measuring attention, weighing this unexpected new alliance against everything the Kitsune clans had already built across the preceding months. You said you came on your own initiative, rather than formal Norse mandate. What does that mean, practically? Does Odin's court know you're here? They know I am investigating, Solveig said. They do not yet know the specific shape that investigation has taken, nor that I intend to propose alliance with an outside coalition. My tradition, like yours once was, remains cautious about outside entanglement, particularly with factions as young and rapidly expanding as yours has proven to be these past 6 months. That's a considerable risk you're taking, then, Issei said. Reaching out without your own court's full backing. It is, Solveig agreed, without hesitation. But I have spent considerable years serving as seer to Odin's court, and I have learned, across that service, that some risks are worth taking on one's own judgment, rather than waiting for consensus that may arrive too slowly to matter. I would rather explain myself to my own tradition after the fact, having acted to protect what needed protecting, than wait for permission that risks arriving only after the danger has already passed. That sounds familiar, Issei said, managing a small, genuine smile despite the conversation's considerable weight. I think every alliance this coalition has built started with someone willing to take exactly that kind of risk first. Solveig's expression softened, just slightly, something like genuine approval settling into her otherwise careful, measured bearing. Then perhaps we are more alike in temperament than either of us initially expected, Sovereign. Chapter 4. The proposal for cooperation between Issei's coalition and Solveig's Norse tradition, while immediately appealing given the shared stakes involved, required careful negotiation over the following days. Solveig's own considerable caution about extending trust beyond her tradition's usual isolated guardianship mirroring, in many ways, the same careful wariness Mehua's Jiuwei clan and Susan's Nine Peaks clan had once shown before eventually choosing alliance. Solveig spent much of the negotiation period as a guest within Yasaka's own household, an arrangement Yasaka had proposed specifically to allow the Norse guardian a genuine, informal glimpse of the coalition's daily character rather than only its carefully staged formal proceedings. Kunou, predictably, took an immediate and enthusiastic interest in the unfamiliar visitor, peppering Solveig with questions about Norse tradition with the same blunt curiosity she brought to nearly everyone new who entered her orbit. Do you have tales too? Kunou asked, during one such exchange, studying Solveig with open, evaluating curiosity. Or is that just a Kitsune thing? No tales, Solveig said, a small, genuinely amused smile touching her otherwise careful, measured expression. My tradition's particular gifts manifest rather differently. Sight, mostly. The ability to perceive threads of fate and consequence that most cannot easily see. That sounds useful, Kunou said. Can you see what's going to happen with all of this? The seals, and whoever's trying to break them? Sight of that kind rarely works so conveniently, Solveig said, her amusement giving way to something more thoughtful. I see fragments, impressions, possibilities rather than certainties. I could not tell you with confidence how this particular story concludes. I can tell you, having spent these past days watching your mother's household, and watching the sovereign your coalition has gathered around, that I see considerably more reason for hope than I expected to find when I first set out to investigate this matter. Kunou seemed satisfied by this answer, if not entirely certain what to make of its careful, hedged nature, and wandered off to report the exchange to Yasaka with obvious enthusiasm, leaving Solveig and Issei alone in the quiet aftermath of the conversation. Your daughter, or rather, Lady Yasaka's daughter, Solveig corrected herself, she reminds me somewhat of myself, at a similar age. Endlessly curious, entirely unafraid to ask the questions careful adults typically avoid. She's one of the best parts of all of this, honestly, Issei said, warmth entering his voice despite the day's considerable weight. I don't think I've ever met anyone quite like her. I believe that, Solveig said. And I believe, watching how naturally she's woven herself into this coalition's daily life, that this alliance you're building is considerably more than simple political convenience. That observation, more than any careful diplomatic argument you might offer, is what's finally settling my remaining hesitation about extending my tradition's trust. I do not extend this offer lightly, Solveig said. During one of the more substantial negotiation sessions, Yasaka and Susan present alongside Issei to help navigate the unfamiliar diplomatic territory. My tradition has guarded our seal in isolation for longer than most currently living Norse figures can properly account for. Extending that guardianship's secrecy to outside factions, however aligned our current interests might be, carries genuine risk. I understand that risk, Issei said. I've watched clan after clan weigh exactly that same calculation these past 6 months. I can't promise you it's risk-free. I can promise you that every alliance this coalition has built so far has been built on exactly the kind of honesty and mutual respect I'm offering you now. Solveig studied him for a long moment, her expression carrying the same careful, measuring quality Issei remembered from Susan's initial assessment on the 9 Peaks mountain months earlier. Your reputation, I confess, undersold the actual quality of your character somewhat, she said finally. I had expected careful diplomatic language, calculated to reassure without genuine substance behind it. What you've offered instead is considerably more honest than I anticipated. I've learned honesty tends to work better than careful diplomatic language, most of the time, Issei said, managing a small, genuine smile despite the weight of the ongoing negotiation. The agreement that finally emerged, cautious but genuine, established a formal information-sharing arrangement between the two traditions, Solveig committing to keep Issei's coalition informed of any further suspicious activity near the North Seal, while Issei's own coalition agreed to extend similar warnings should anything concerning develop at the veiled threshold. More significantly, Solveig agreed to share her own tradition's considerable historical records regarding the fractured entity, records that, cross-referenced against Azazel's ongoing research and Yasaka's Kitsune archives, promised to fill in considerable gaps in the coalition's still incomplete understanding. There is one more matter, Solveig said, as the formal negotiations drew toward their conclusion, that I believe you should understand before we conclude today's discussion. My own tradition's records mention something yours apparently have not yet uncovered, a name, of sorts, associated with previous attempts to exploit these scattered seals for personal gain. Not a title like the Bound Flame Sovereign's failed restoration attempt, but something closer to an ongoing pattern, spanning centuries, of a single influence, or perhaps a lineage of influences, working patiently across generations to gather exactly the kind of scattered power your root represents. A single influence spanning centuries, Rias repeated slowly, her strategic mind clearly working through the unsettling implications. That would explain how someone managed to coordinate intelligence sophisticated enough to target both your seal and ours, despite the geographic and cultural distance between them. Precisely my own concern, Solveig said. Our records refer to this influence only obliquely, as the gatherer, without further identifying detail. But if this pattern has genuinely persisted across centuries, whoever or whatever currently operates under that title represents a threat considerably more patient and dangerous than any single rogue faction we've previously considered. Susan, who had remained largely quiet through the earlier portions of the negotiation, finally spoke, her expression carrying a troubled recognition that immediately drew the room's full attention. The Bound Flame Sovereign's account, she said slowly, the one describing his failed restoration attempt centuries ago. There was a detail I did not previously consider significant, a brief, fragmentary reference to an unnamed advisor who apparently encouraged his desperate final attempt, someone the surviving records describe only as having appeared suddenly during his coalition's darkest hour, offering counsel that, in hindsight, seems to have hastened rather than prevented the eventual catastrophe. The implication settled with cold, immediate weight over the gathered group, and Issei felt something tighten uncomfortably in his chest at the realization forming. You think the gatherer was involved in that disaster too, he said. Not just watching from a distance, but actually pushing him toward the attempt that killed him and a third of his coalition. I cannot confirm it with certainty, Susan said. The record is too fragmentary for that. But the pattern fits uncomfortably well, considering everything Solveig has shared today. If true, it would mean the Gatherer has been patiently working toward exactly this outcome, a sovereign's desperate, catastrophic attempt at full restoration, for considerably longer than any of us previously understood. Do your records suggest any pattern to how the Gatherer typically operates? Yasaka asked, her own considerable experience with long-term strategic threats clearly engaged by the question. If this influence has persisted across centuries, there may be recognizable habits worth understanding, even without a clear identity attached to them. Patience, primarily, Solveig said. Every reference our tradition holds describes an influence willing to work through intermediaries, through desperate or ambitious individuals like your Tetsuya, rather than acting directly. That pattern alone suggests either genuine caution, unwillingness to risk direct exposure, or perhaps some limitation preventing direct action entirely. I do not know which explanation holds true, but I believe the distinction matters considerably for how we ultimately choose to respond. If it's caution, Rias said, working through the implications with careful, strategic attention, that suggests the Gatherer is vulnerable in ways we haven't yet identified, and worried enough about that vulnerability to avoid direct confrontation. If it's limitation, though, that might mean something is physically preventing direct action, which could be either good news or considerably worse news depending on what that limitation actually is. An astute distinction, Solveig said, something like genuine respect entering her tone. I confess I had not considered the question in quite those terms before today. Your coalition's strategic thinking is considerably sharper than the reports I'd gathered suggested. We've had a lot of practice, Issei said, managing a tired smile. Most of it earned the hard way. Chapter 5. The formal alliance between Issei's coalition and Solveig's Norse tradition, once finalized, was marked by a considerably simpler ceremony than the elaborate coronation months earlier, a quiet exchange of formal words between Issei and Solveig within Yasaka's own residence, witnessed by the core group who had, by now, become fixtures at every significant turning point of this expanding journey. This is not a binding in the same sense as your coronation, Solveig explained, as the small ceremony concluded. My tradition does not practice the same kind of bloodline exchange your kitsune ceremonies employ. This is, instead, a formal oath, sworn before witnesses, that our respective traditions will stand together against whatever threat this scattered guardianship ultimately faces. That's more than enough, Issei said. I don't think every alliance needs to look the same to be genuine. No, Solveig agreed, it does not. I find myself, increasingly, grateful that your particular approach to alliance building has never insisted otherwise. Word of the Gatherer's possible existence spread quickly through the wider coalition once the formal alliance with Solveig's tradition solidified, and it was during the careful, ongoing work of cross-referencing Norse and Kitsune records that the first concrete evidence of the Gatherer's current activity finally surfaced, a pattern of unusual, coordinated movement near a third seal location, this one maintained, according to Solveig's own tradition's fragmentary records, by a guardianship connected to ancient Egyptian mythology. We do not have direct contact with whatever tradition currently maintains that particular guardianship, Solveig admitted, when the pattern first emerged from the coalition's combined research. Our own records only reference its existence obliquely, a seal maintained near what our sources call the desert threshold, guarded by a tradition considerably more insular than either of ours has proven to be. If the Gatherer is targeting a third seal, Issei said, and we can't even reach the Guardians to warn them, that's a serious problem. Agreed, Azazel said, having joined the discussion via a hastily arranged connection once the pattern's significance became clear. I have some limited contacts within circles that might have insight into the relevant Egyptian tradition, though I'll be honest, my own research has never extended that direction with much depth. I'll do what I can to establish contact, but it may take time we're not entirely certain we have. The uncertainty of that timeline settled uncomfortably over the coalition, and it was Kuroka, arriving partway through the discussion with her own network's latest intelligence, who finally provided the concrete urgency the situation demanded. Got confirmation the movement near that third location isn't just probing anymore, she reported. Whoever's coordinating this, they're moving considerably faster than they did with either of the first two seals. My best guess, based on the pattern so far, they're planning an actual attempt within days, not weeks. Then we don't have time to wait for a proper introduction, Ria said, her strategic focus sharpening immediately. Issei, I think this is a situation where we need to act first and explain ourselves afterward, assuming the guardians there are willing to hear us out once we arrive. That's a considerable risk, Susan cautioned. Arriving unannounced at another tradition's guarded, secret location could easily be interpreted as hostile intent, regardless of our actual purpose. It's a risk, Issei agreed, but I don't see a better option, not with days instead of weeks to work with. If the gatherer succeeds in breaking a third seal while we're still trying to figure out the polite way to introduce ourselves, that's considerably worse than the risk of a tense first meeting. Kunou, present for the planning session despite the considerably longer distance involved this time, spoke up with the same determined insistence she'd shown before the defense of the veiled threshold. I want to come this time too. Not just supporting wards from a safe distance. I've gotten stronger since then. Yasaka studied her daughter carefully before answering, weighing the request against the considerable distance and unfamiliar danger involved. This journey will take us considerably further from home than anything we've previously attempted, Kunou, into territory none of us have any real familiarity with. I am not comfortable bringing you along this time, not because I doubt your growing strength, but because the unknowns here are simply too significant. I understand, Kunou said, though clear disappointment colored her voice despite her attempt at composed acceptance. I still want to help somehow, even if I can't come. You can, Yasaka said gently. I would like you to remain here, coordinating with Gasper and Asia to keep watch over the veiled threshold in our absence. If the gatherer's attention is divided across multiple locations, it is entirely possible our own seal could face renewed pressure while we're away. That responsibility matters just as much as anything happening at the desert threshold. Kunou considered this, some of her disappointment easing into thoughtful acceptance. I can do that. I'll make sure nothing happens here while you're gone. I know you will, Issei said, offering her a warm, genuine smile despite the day's mounting tension. That's exactly the kind of responsibility this coalition needs, Kunou. Just as much as anyone fighting on the front lines. The decision to intervene directly, made carefully but urgently given the compressed timeline, brought together a considerably larger expedition than the coalition's previous investigation of the veiled threshold, Solveig herself joining alongside Issei's core group. Her own tradition's experience with seal guardianship proving invaluable for navigating whatever defenses the unfamiliar Egyptian tradition might have established around their own guarded site. Chapter 6. The journey toward the desert threshold carried a considerably different character than the coalition's previous expedition to the veiled threshold, the small, urgent group moving through unfamiliar terrain with Solveig's own considerable travel experience proving invaluable for navigating a region none of Issei's core coalition had ever previously visited. How does your tradition typically travel such distances? Issei asked, during a brief rest partway through their journey, watching Solveig consult a small, intricately carved instrument that bore little resemblance to Shiro's own ley-line compass. Old pathways, Solveig explained. Routes established by travelers considerably more ancient than either of our current traditions, threads connecting significant locations across the world in ways modern maps rarely capture properly. My own tradition has maintained knowledge of these pathways for centuries, largely for exactly this kind of urgent, cross-regional travel. I didn't realize the world was quite this connected, Issei admitted, genuinely struck by the scope of what Solveig's simple explanation implied. Few do, Solveig said. That is, I suspect, rather the point. Old things prefer old secrets, and the world's oldest pathways have remained hidden precisely because so few traditions ever bothered maintaining the knowledge required to use them properly. Shiro, listening to the exchange with evident interest, added her own thoughtful observation. My clan's own ley-line sensitivity has always felt, to me, like a small fragment of something considerably larger than our modest mountain shrine ever fully explained. Hearing you describe these ancient pathways, I find myself wondering whether our two traditions' gifts share more common root than either of us previously understood. That would not surprise me, Solveig said. Given everything else this journey has revealed about how much more connected our separate traditions have always been, beneath the surface of our accumulated isolation, the desert threshold, when the Coalition's expedition finally located it after a tense, urgent journey guided by fragments of Solveig's records and Shiro's now well-practiced ability to sense ley line convergences, proved to be a hidden, sand-swept complex built into the base of ancient ruins. Considerably different in character from either the veiled threshold's mist-shrouded valley or whatever similarly guarded site protected the Norse tradition's own fragment. The confrontation, when it came, arrived not from the seal's own guardians, who remained notably absent despite the Coalition's careful, respectful approach, but from a coordinated group of attackers already deep in the process of attempting to breach the ancient site's defenses, confirming Kuroka's urgent warning with alarming, immediate clarity. "We're not too late," Ria said, assessing the scene with practiced, rapid strategic calculation. "But we're cutting this considerably closer than I'd like." The battle that followed unfolded with the same practiced, hard-won coordination the Coalition had developed across every previous confrontation, Solveig's own considerable strength proving a formidable, welcome addition, her particular Norse magic disrupting the attacker's coordinated assault with techniques entirely unfamiliar to Issei but clearly, immediately effective. Rias directed the Coalition's response with practiced efficiency despite the unfamiliar terrain, Kiba and Kaneko anchoring the perimeter's most immediate approach while Akino's lightning arced across the sand-swept ruins, illuminating the confrontation in brief, brilliant flashes. Shiro, adapting her ward work to unfamiliar architecture with impressive speed, established protective barriers around the seal itself even as the wider battle continued raging around them. These attackers moved differently than Tetsuya's people did, Kiba observed, deflecting a coordinated strike with practiced precision. More discipline. Less desperation. Professional, rather than personally motivated, Rias agreed, redirecting her own attention toward a cluster of attackers attempting to flank Shiro's ward work. That matches everything Solveig's records suggested about the gatherer's typical methods. Issei fought near the seal's edge, keenly aware of the parallel to the veiled threshold's own recent defense, the same desperate urgency, the same need to prevent something ancient and fractured from being seized by hands that clearly did not understand, or did not care about, the genuine cost such seizure might exact. The attackers here, unlike Tetsuya's more personally motivated Ashen Court remnants, fought with a cold, professional efficiency that suggested considerably more direct connection to whatever patient, centuries-spanning influence Solveig's records had termed the gatherer. The battle's conclusion came only after a considerable, exhausting effort, the Coalition's combined strength, still unfamiliar with each other's particular fighting styles but bound by shared, urgent purpose, finally overwhelming the coordinated assault and forcing a retreat considerably more organized and deliberate than either of the Coalition's previous victories against the Ashen Court's remnants, a retreat that felt uncomfortably less like defeat and more like a calculated withdrawal. As the immediate danger passed, a figure finally emerged from the ancient ruins' hidden depths, an elderly guardian whose bearing carried the unmistakable weight of considerable age and careful, isolated tradition, studying the gathered Coalition with evident surprise and no small measure of wary caution. "You are not the attackers," the guardian said slowly, in careful, accented Japanese. "Yet you arrived in time to intervene against them. I confess I do not fully understand what has brought outsiders to a threshold my tradition has guarded in secret for considerably longer than most current factions have existed. My name is Issei," he said, offering the same honest introduction that had, across 6 months of steadily expanding alliance, proven considerably more valuable than any careful diplomatic strategy. "I think your seal and mine might be connected, protecting pieces of the same ancient, fractured thing. We came because we learned someone was planning to attack this place, and we didn't want to arrive too late to help. I am Nefret," the guardian said, some of her wary caution finally easing as the immediate danger receded fully. "Keeper of this threshold, as my family has been for longer generations than our own records fully account for. I confess your intervention arrived at a considerably fortunate moment. My own guardianship has grown thin these past years, fewer capable hands willing to take up this particular, isolated burden with each passing generation." "That sounds familiar too," Issei said. The Kitsune clans spent generations fractured and isolated before this coalition started bringing them back together. I don't know if what we've built could work the same way for your tradition, but I'd like to try, if you're willing. Nefret studied him for a long, considering moment, weighing the unexpected intervention against centuries of careful, isolated tradition, before finally, slowly, allowing something like cautious relief to settle into her expression. Then I believe, she said, that we have considerably more to discuss than either of us anticipated when this day began. As the coalition began the careful work of assessing the desert threshold's own strained defenses, exchanging preliminary introductions with a tradition none of them had known existed only weeks earlier, Issei found himself, once again, struck by how rapidly this ancient mystery continued to expand beyond anything he'd originally understood. 3 seals now confirmed, connected by threads of shared history and a patient, unseen enemy considerably larger and more coordinated than anything the coalition had previously faced. Nefret, once the immediate work of assessing her threshold's strained defenses had settled into quieter, more thorough discussion, approached Issei directly as the evening deepened around the ancient ruins. I have spent considerable years believing my tradition's isolation was simply the price of protecting something this important properly, she said. Watching your coalition work together today, Kitsune and Norse, and now, apparently, whatever you yourself represent, all coordinating with a trust one have never witnessed among factions so different from one another, I find myself questioning whether isolation was ever truly the safest choice at all. I don't think it was, Issei said honestly. Not because isolation is inherently wrong, but because facing something this big alone, that's exactly the kind of situation the bound flame sovereign found himself in, centuries ago, right before his own attempt ended in disaster. I think isolation feels safe until the moment it isn't, and by then it's usually too late to build the kind of support you actually needed. A sobering thought, Nefret said, but not, I think, an inaccurate one. I will need to consult what remains of my own tradition's scattered elders before committing to anything as significant as formal alliance. But I believe, given everything I have witnessed today, that consultation will carry a recommendation in your favor. That's more than I expected to accomplish today, Issei admitted, managing a tired, genuine smile despite the day's considerable exhaustion. Sometimes the most significant accomplishments arrive precisely when we expect them least, Nefret said, offering a small, formal bow considerably warmer than her earlier wary caution had suggested possible only hours before. Rias, joining the conversation as it wound toward its natural conclusion, offered her own quiet reflection once Nefret had withdrawn to begin the careful work of consulting her tradition's remaining elders. 3 seals, 3 traditions, and a coalition that keeps growing faster than any of us really anticipated when this all started, she said. I keep thinking about how impossible this would have sounded, back when we were still trying to convince Lord Agars that a Kitsune sovereign wasn't some kind of threat to the underworld's careful balance. It does feel like a long way from that first council meeting, Issei agreed. I don't know if I would have believed any of this, back then, if someone had tried to explain where we'd actually end up. I'm not sure any of us would have, Rias said. But I think that's rather the nature of everything we've built together, Issei. One honest step leading to the next, each one larger than the last, until you look back and realize just how far that pattern has actually carried you. Solveig, standing beside him as the desert evening settled slowly around the ancient ruins, offered a small, thoughtful observation that lingered with him long after the day's considerable exhaustion finally caught up with him. 3 seals confirmed now, she said. I find myself wondering, Sovereign, how many more we have yet to discover, and how much longer we have before the gatherer's patience finally runs out entirely. I don't know, Issei admitted honestly. But I think, whatever comes next, we're going to face it the same way we've faced everything else. Together, and as honestly as we can manage. That, Solveig said, a small, genuine smile touching her expression despite the day's considerable weight, is, I am increasingly certain, precisely why the old bloodline chose to waken you, of everyone it might have chosen instead. Act 8, Chapter 1. The 12 days following the coalition's defense of the desert threshold passed in a quieter, more reflective rhythm than the preceding months had generally allowed, Issei finding himself, for the first time in what felt like a considerable while, able to simply attend school, train with Yasaka, and spend ordinary evenings with his peerage without the immediate pressure of an unfolding crisis demanding constant attention. Enjoy it while it lasts, Rias had advised, during one such quiet evening, watching Issei relax into the clubroom's familiar comfort with visible, well-earned relief. I don't imagine this pace holds indefinitely, given everything we've learned these past months. But there's no reason not to appreciate it while it does. I'm trying to, Issei admitted. It still feels strange, honestly. Being able to just sit here, worrying about ordinary things like homework instead of ancient fractured entities and coordinated assaults. That's not a bad kind of strange to feel, Asia said, settling nearby with a warm, genuine smile. I think we could all use a little more of this particular strangeness, honestly. Nefret's formal decision arrived 12 days after the battle at the desert threshold, delivered not through any of the coalition's now familiar channels, but through Solveig's own ancient pathways, a testament to how quickly the newly formed alliance between Norse and Egyptian traditions had already begun bearing practical fruit. My tradition's remaining elders have agreed, Nefret's message read, translated carefully by Solveig upon its arrival. The desert threshold will stand with your coalition, formally, though I ask for patience as we adjust to an alliance considerably larger than anything my isolated tradition has managed in living memory. That's wonderful news, Issei said, relief evident in his voice as he read through the full message. For traditions now, all connected, all working together. For confirmed seals, Yasaka corrected gently, though I suspect, given everything we've learned these past months, there are considerably more scattered across the world than the 4 we currently know about. The Kitsune clans, the Norse tradition, the Egyptian threshold, and whatever your own coronation eventually revealed connects the route to dragons more broadly. That is not the full picture, Issei. I do not believe we have found the full picture yet. How do we even start looking for more? Rias asked, her strategic mind already turning toward the practical challenge of expanding an already considerable undertaking. We got lucky, in a sense, with the Norse and Egyptian connections. Tetsuya's warning, Solveig's own initiative, Kuroka's intelligence network catching the pattern in time. We can't necessarily count on that same luck holding for whatever other seals exist. Perhaps not luck alone, Meihua offered, having traveled to Kyoto specifically for this discussion once word of Nefret's decision reached her. But pattern recognition, properly applied, might serve us considerably better than luck ever could. Every seal we've identified so far shares certain structural similarities, iconography blending draconic and elemental motifs, locations at significant ley line convergences, guardianship maintained by traditions that trace their own origins back further than most currently recognized history. If we catalog those shared characteristics carefully, we may be able to predict where additional seals are likely to exist, rather than simply waiting for crisis to reveal them. That's a considerable undertaking, Issei said. Cataloging ley line convergences and ancient iconography across the entire world. It is, Meihua agreed. But I believe, given everything currently at stake, it represents time well spent. Better to locate and protect these remaining seals proactively than to continue reacting to the gatherer's own patient timeline. Azazel, joining the discussion via one of his now regular check-ins, offered his own considerable resources toward the effort. The Gregory's research capacity is at your disposal, he said. I'll pull together a proper research team, combine it with whatever Meihua's clan and Yasaka's own archives can contribute, and we'll see what pattern actually emerges. Might take weeks, possibly longer, but I think it's exactly the right approach. Kunou, who had been listening to the planning session with her usual restless energy, brightened considerably at the news of Nefret's formal alliance. For now, she said, counting on her fingers with evident satisfaction. Mother's clan, matriarch Meihua's clan, Solveig's tradition, and now Nefret's threshold. That's a lot of new people to learn about. Does Nefret have kids my age? I want someone to actually understand what it's like, watching all of you have the important, scary meetings while I have to wait outside. I don't know, Issei admitted, managing a tired laugh despite the day's considerable wait. I'll ask, next time we're in contact with her tradition directly. You should invite her here properly, Kunou said, with the particular confidence of someone who had clearly given the matter considerable thought. Solveig stayed with us for a while, and that worked out well. I bet Nefert would like Kyoto too, once she gets used to it. That's actually a good idea, Yasaka said, exchanging an approving glance with her daughter. A formal visit would help solidify the alliance considerably more than continued exchange through Solveig's pathways alone. I will extend the invitation personally. Word of Nefert's formal visit, arranged over the following week, brought a new energy to the coalition's daily rhythm, the Desert Threshold's guardian arriving with evident curiosity about the wider alliance she had only glimpsed briefly during the chaos of battle weeks earlier. She toured Kyoto's hidden district with open fascination, comparing notes with Susan about the considerable challenges of maintaining guardianship across so many isolated generations, and found herself, by the visit's end, considerably more at ease within the coalition's warm, sprawling family than her earlier careful caution had initially suggested possible. I confess, Nefert said during a quiet evening near the close of her visit, I did not expect to feel so quickly at home among traditions so different from my own. My own guardianship has always felt, across generations, like a solitary burden passed carefully from keeper to keeper. This feels considerably less lonely. That's rather the whole point, Issei said, smiling warmly despite the day's considerable exhaustion from the ongoing research efforts. None of us are meant to carry this alone. I think that's the biggest lesson this entire coalition keeps teaching, every single time we add someone new. Chapter 2. The research team Azazel had assembled began its work in earnest during the week following Nefert's formal visit, a considerably larger undertaking than any previous coalition research effort, drawing not only on Gregory and Gremory archives but now also on fragments Solveig's Norse tradition and Nefert's own considerable Egyptian records could contribute. 4 traditions accumulated knowledge finally converging into something approaching a genuinely comprehensive picture of the scattered roots history. It's slow going, Azazel admitted, during one of his regular updates. Cross-referencing 4 separate traditions' historical records, each with their own particular translation challenges and cultural framing, that's not work that moves quickly no matter how many capable researchers we throw at it. But we are making progress, even if it doesn't always feel that way day to day. Issei, listening to the update with the same patient attention he'd learned to bring to every stage of this long, unfolding mystery, found himself grateful, once again, for the depth of expertise now gathered around this shared, considerable undertaking. Take whatever time you need, he said. I'd rather have this done carefully than rushed into mistakes we can't easily undo. The dream returned that same night, more vivid and considerably more coherent than any previous visitation, and Issei woke the following morning with a clarity of recollection that felt distinctly different from the fragmented, impressionistic quality of every earlier contact. In the dream, he had stood not within the mist-shrouded valley of the veiled threshold, but in a place that felt considerably older, a vast, formless space that seemed to exist somewhere beneath or beyond every individual seal he had so far encountered, as though he had, for just a moment, glimpsed the fragmented entity's true, scattered nature rather than any single contained piece of it. You are gathering pieces of me back into contact with one another, the presence had communicated, considerably more clearly this time, though still not in words exactly. Through your alliances, your coalition, your careful, patient work of connecting traditions that forgot they were ever related. I feel that gathering, even trapped as I remain. It brings something I had nearly forgotten how to feel. What do you feel? Issei had asked, within the dream, aware even as he asked that he was somehow communicating back, however imperfectly. Hope, the presence had said, and the word carried a weight that made Issei's chest ache even in memory, hours after waking. I have been afraid, for longer than your kind has existed in its current form, that no one would ever attempt what you are attempting. That the fracture would simply remain, forever, and that whatever remained of me would fade slowly into nothing, unremembered and unmourned. There's someone else too, Issei had said, working carefully through the dream's strange logic. Someone who wants to use what happened to you. They call themselves, or you call them, the Gatherer. Something in the presence had shifted at that, the earlier warmth curdling into something colder, more guarded. You know that name, the presence had said. Then you must also understand the danger it represents. The Gatherer does not seek healing, Sovereign. The Gatherer seeks possession. To gather my scattered pieces not for restoration, but for consumption, claiming the power my fracture represents without ever caring for what remains of me underneath that power. Do you know who the gatherer actually is? The presence had hesitated, and Issei sensed, even within the dream's strange logic, something that felt uncomfortably like fear. Once, the presence finally said. Long ago, before even my own fracture. But memory this old grows uncertain, fragmented, unreliable. I cannot give you a name with any confidence, Sovereign. I can only warn you that whatever seeks to gather my scattered pieces has done so before. Across ages your own history has entirely forgotten, and has never once succeeded through anything resembling kindness. What happens if it succeeds? Issei had asked, aware of how much weight the question carried even within the dream's strange, formless logic. If the gatherer actually manages to consume what's left of you. I do not know with certainty, the presence admitted. I only know that whatever emptiness drives the gatherer's hunger has never once been satisfied, across every previous attempt. I fear, though I cannot promise this fear is accurate, that consumption would not end that hunger. It would simply feed it further, granting it strength enough to seek out whatever remains of your own kind's power next, dragon and kitsune both, and beyond that, likely further still. The weight of that warning had settled over Issei even within the dream, and he found himself waking with a clarity of purpose that felt, despite the unsettling nature of everything he'd just learned, oddly steadying rather than purely frightening. Issei relayed the full dream to the gathered coalition later that morning, watching their expressions settle into the particular gravity that had accompanied every previous major revelation of this expanding mystery. Consumption, rather than healing, Rias repeated slowly. That's considerably more concerning than even the bound flame sovereign's failed restoration attempt. At least he was trying to help, however catastrophically it went wrong. If the gatherer has attempted this before, across ages our own history has forgotten, Susan said, her expression troubled. That suggests a pattern considerably older and more persistent than anything we've previously considered. Not simply centuries, but perhaps ages beyond even our oldest surviving records. Kiba, listening with careful, focused attention, offered his own strategic observation. If it's never once succeeded, across all those previous attempts, that means whatever stopped it before might still be relevant now. Maybe the fragmented pieces themselves resist consumption somehow. Or maybe there's something about how the seals were built that makes the gatherer's hunger fundamentally difficult to satisfy. That's a good question to bring to Azazel's research team, Rias said. If there's a pattern to the gatherer's previous failures, understanding that pattern might tell us considerably more about how to protect what remains now. Kaneko, quiet through most of the discussion, finally spoke, her characteristic bluntness cutting through the mounting complexity. Doesn't matter how many times it's failed before. Matters whether it succeeds this time. We should focus on that. She's right, Issei said, nodding slowly. History's useful for understanding what we're facing. But we still need to actually stop it, here and now, regardless of how many times it's failed in the past. Chapter 3. The revelation of the gatherer's ancient, recurring pattern sent the coalition's research efforts into a new, more urgent phase. Azazel's assembled team working alongside Yasaka's archivists and Meihua's own considerable historical resources to search not simply for additional seal locations, but for any surviving fragment of history that might shed light on the gatherer's actual nature and identity. Shiro contributed her own quiet, methodical assistance throughout the 3 weeks that followed, her clan's small but meticulously maintained archive yielding a handful of fragmentary references that, while insufficient on their own to draw firm conclusions, added useful texture to the coalition's steadily growing understanding. My clan has always kept careful records of ley line anomalies, she explained, during one of the research sessions, generations of small, patient observation rather than any grand historical narrative. I do not know if these fragments will prove useful, but I did not want to withhold anything that might contribute, however modestly. Every fragment matters, Issei told her, genuinely grateful for the quiet, unglamorous persistence she brought to the effort. This whole mystery keeps getting solved one small piece at a time. I don't think there's such a thing as too small a contribution. The breakthrough, when it finally arrived nearly 3 weeks later, came from an unexpected source, a fragment of text buried within the Gregory's own considerable archives, predating even the oldest biblical faction records, describing what appeared to be an ancient conflict between the still whole, unfractured root and a being the fragmented text referred to only as the hollow crown. The translation is difficult, Azazel admitted, presenting the fragment during a hastily arranged coalition meeting. The language itself predates anything I have proper reference material for, and what we've managed to reconstruct is, admittedly, more educated guesswork than confident translation. But the pattern it describes aligns disturbingly well with everything Issei's dream contact suggested. What does it say, as best you can tell? Issei asked. That the hollow crown was, once, whole itself, Azazel said. A being of considerable power, though the text suggests that power came at a cost, some manner of fundamental incompleteness built into its very nature, an emptiness that no amount of accumulated power ever seemed to fill. The fragment suggests the hollow crown sought, across considerable ages, to consume other whole, powerful beings, believing each consumption might finally fill whatever void defined its own existence. It never worked. The emptiness simply persisted, regardless of how much power it accumulated. And you think this hollow crown eventually targeted the root, Meihua said, working through the implications with careful, historian's attention. I believe it's a strong possibility, Azazel said. The fragment's account grows considerably less clear toward its conclusion, damage to the original text obscuring whatever final confrontation actually occurred. But the timing aligns roughly with when other, independent sources suggest the root's own fracturing took place. It's entirely possible the fracture itself was not some natural process, or even a deliberate sacrifice, as Susan's earlier research suggested, but rather a direct consequence of confrontation with the hollow crown. The weight of that revised understanding settled heavily over the gathered coalition, reshaping everything they had previously assumed about the root's ancient history. If the hollow crown caused the fracture in the first place, Issei said slowly, working through the implications, and if it's been trying to gather those scattered pieces back together ever since, not to heal them, but to finally fill whatever emptiness defines its own existence, that changes everything about how we should think about protecting the remaining seals. It does, Yasaka agreed. Because it suggests the gatherer is not simply an opportunist seeking power for power's own sake, but something considerably more desperate, and considerably more ancient, driven by a hunger that has apparently never once been satisfied across ages of patient, persistent attempt. Drake, stirring within Issei's mind as the implications settled fully over the gathered coalition, offered his own careful, ancient perspective on the revelation. I have heard old draconic legends, partner, fragments passed down across generations of my own kind, describing a hollow, hungering presence that even the eldest dragons learn to avoid rather than confront directly. I always assumed those legends were simple cautionary tales, warnings against the dangers of unchecked ambition rather than genuine historical account. I am considerably less certain of that assumption now. Do your legends say anything about how it was avoided, or how it might actually be stopped? Issei asked, relaying Drake's observation to the gathered group. Only that confronting it directly, seeking to defeat it through raw strength alone, never once succeeded, Drake said. The oldest dragons who survived encounters with whatever this hollow presence actually was apparently did so through avoidance, or through some manner of clever redirection rather than direct confrontation. I do not know the specifics. The legends were never detailed enough for that. But the pattern aligns, uncomfortably, with everything you've now learned about the hollow crown's own unbroken history of failure and persistence. Rias, absorbing Drake's account alongside everything Azazel had already shared, turned her considerable strategic attention toward the practical implications. If direct confrontation has never worked for anyone, across all this recorded and legendary history, then our entire approach needs to account for that pattern. We can't assume today's battle, or tomorrow's, will simply be won through greater strength. We need to find whatever clever redirection actually worked, historically, and understand why it worked well enough to replicate it deliberately, rather than stumbling into it by accident. That's exactly the kind of research question I should have been asking from the start, Azazel admitted, something like genuine frustration with himself crossing his usually composed expression. I've been so focused on identifying the gatherer's nature that I hadn't properly considered the pattern of its historical failures. That's a mistake I intend to correct immediately. Chapter 4. The Gatherer's first direct contact arrived less than a week after the Coalition's discovery of the Hollow Crown fragment, and it came not through any intermediary or proxy, but through a dream considerably different in character from Issei's ongoing, gentle contact with the sealed fragment itself. Issei found himself, within this new and unwelcome dream, standing not in the formless space where the fragment's presence typically communicated, but in a cold, hollow expanse that felt like the deliberate opposite of every warm, grieving impression he had grown accustomed to receiving from the root. Sovereign, a voice had said, considerably clearer and more deliberate than the fragment's own impressionistic communication had ever managed, carrying an authority that made Issei's instincts flare with immediate, wary alertness. I have watched your careful, patient work with genuine interest. Four seals reconnected, in a manner of speaking, through your considerable diplomatic effort. Impressive for someone so recently arrived to this particular understanding of the world. You're the Gatherer, Issei had said, within the dream, forcing himself to hold steady despite the presence's unsettling, deliberate coldness. Among other names, across other ages, the voice had confirmed. I find myself, Sovereign, considering a proposition I have not extended to any claimant of your bloodline in longer than your kind's history properly accounts for. You have done remarkable work, reconnecting these scattered fragments through alliance rather than force. I propose we finish that work together, rather than as adversaries. Complete what your bloodline began, and share in the power that completion would represent. That's not what completing this actually means, though, Issei had said, remembering clearly everything the root's own fragment had warned him about. You don't want to heal it. You want to consume it, to fill whatever's empty in you. That's not the same thing as finishing what I started. Semantics, the voice had replied, something almost amused threading through its cold authority. Call it healing, call it consumption, call it whatever framing helps you sleep at night, Sovereign. The result, for you, remains identical. Power beyond anything your current bloodline can offer, power enough to protect everyone you currently strain yourself protecting, without ever again fearing an assault like the one that nearly claimed your friends in that gymnasium so many months ago. I offer you an end to fear, Sovereign. Consider carefully what you are refusing before you refuse it. The offer had settled uncomfortably close to something genuine, and Issei found himself, even within the dream's strange logic, forced to consciously push past the flicker of temptation that unsettled him more than the presence's cold authority ever could. I don't want power that comes from hurting something that's already been hurt enough, he had said, finally, his voice steadier than he expected given the offer's uncomfortable pull. Whatever fear I've carried, whatever I'm still scared of, that's not worth trading away someone else's chance at actually healing, even if that someone is a fractured, ancient thing I barely understand. A pause had followed, considerably longer than felt entirely comfortable, before the voice had responded, its earlier deliberate coolness sharpening into something colder still. You have spoken with it, then. Interesting, that it retains enough coherence to communicate at all, after everything. No matter. Whatever it has told you, understand this, Sovereign. I have pursued this reconnection across ages your own history has entirely forgotten. I do not intend to be denied by a mortal boy barely months into his own considerable, but still limited power. I'm not going to help you, Issei had said, meeting the presence's cold authority with the same stubborn resolve that had carried him through every previous confrontation. Whatever you're actually after, I don't think it's something I want any part of helping you get. Then we understand each other clearly, the voice had said, the dream beginning to fracture and fade around the words. I had hoped, given your unusual pattern of diplomacy over conquest, that you might prove more pragmatic than your predecessors. It seems I was mistaken. Very well, Sovereign. We will simply continue as adversaries, then. I trust you understand what that means, given everything you've already learned about my own considerable patience. Issei woke with a start, the dream's cold, deliberate weight lingering considerably longer than any previous contact from the root itself, and found himself, within minutes, relaying the full exchange to a coalition gathered with mounting, urgent concern. Direct contact, Rhea said, her strategic mind immediately working through the implications. That's a significant escalation. Whatever patience the Gatherer has shown so far, working through intermediaries and careful, distant coordination, that patience apparently just ran out. What do we do now? Issei asked, aware of the weight settling over the entire coalition. We prepare, Yasaka said simply, though her expression carried a gravity that suggested even she understood how much larger this particular preparation might need to become. For whatever the gatherer intends to do next, now that patience and manipulation through proxies has given way to direct confrontation. Chapter 5. The gatherer's response to Issei's refusal arrived not as another dream, but as a considerably more immediate, physical threat, a coordinated assault against the veiled threshold that dwarfed, in both scale and sophistication, anything the coalition had previously faced defending that particular seal. In the days immediately following the unsettling dream confrontation, Issei had insisted on strengthening the veiled threshold's defenses beyond even the considerable preparations undertaken before the earlier Ashen Court assault, a decision that, in hindsight, proved to have granted the coalition precious additional time to respond once the gatherer's retaliation finally arrived. Shiro had layered fresh wards atop the valley's existing defenses. Rias had coordinated a rotating watch schedule that kept experienced defenders present at all times rather than relying solely on Kunou's dedicated but still developing capability, and Kuroka's network had been placed on heightened alert, specifically watching for exactly the kind of large-scale mobilization the gatherer's cold, deliberate warning had suggested might follow. I didn't expect it to actually help this quickly, Issei admitted, during a brief planning session only days before the assault finally arrived, but I'd rather we were over-prepared than caught off guard again. That instinct likely saved considerable lives today, Rias would later observe, once the battle's scale became clear. Whatever else this confrontation costs us, at least we weren't facing it with the same thin defenses we managed against Tetsuya's original assault. Word reached Issei through Kunou, who had maintained her watch over the veiled threshold exactly as promised. Her urgent message relayed through Yasaka's own considerable network the moment the disturbance began. By the time Issei and the gathered coalition arrived, the valley's carefully maintained defenses were already straining under pressure from attackers considerably more numerous and coordinated than anything the Ashen Court's remnants had ever managed, their assault carrying the same cold, professional efficiency Issei recognized from the Desert Threshold's own recent defense. They're not even trying to disguise their coordination this time, Rias observed, assessing the scale of the assault with rapid, practiced strategic calculation. This isn't opportunistic anymore. This is a direct, deliberate strike. Kunou, positioned exactly where her training and Shiro's careful guidance had prepared her, held her assigned section of ward with fierce, determined concentration despite the assault's considerably greater intensity than anything she'd previously faced. I held it, she called out, as Issei arrived at her position, relief evident in her young voice despite the strain clearly etched across her features. I held it the whole time, even when it got scary. You did perfectly, Issei said, genuine pride and relief mingling as he took in her evident exhaustion but clear, unwavering resolve. Get back to a safer position now. Let us handle the rest. The battle that followed tested the coalition's accumulated strength more thoroughly than any previous confrontation. Solveig's Norse magic and Nefret's own considerable Egyptian tradition, both newly integrated into the coalition's defensive coordination, proving essential additions as the assault pressed against multiple points of the valley's perimeter simultaneously. Heian's autumn red tails wove through the chaos with practiced, considerable force. Lien's specialized countermeasures disrupting the attacker's own coordinated magic wherever it threatened to overwhelm the coalition's defenses. Nefret, fighting alongside allies from traditions entirely unfamiliar to her only weeks earlier, moved through the chaos with the particular fierce focus of someone determined to prove her tradition's alliance had been the right decision. This is considerably larger than the assault at my own threshold, she called out to Solveig, fighting nearby. Is this typical? Once the gatherer commits to direct confrontation? I do not know, Solveig admitted, deflecting a coordinated strike with practiced precision. But I suspect we are about to learn considerably more about the gatherer's true capability than any of us previously understood. Issei fought near the seal's center, aware with sharp, immediate clarity of the parallel to every previous confrontation, the same desperate urgency, though considerably amplified now by the knowledge of exactly what force actually coordinated this assault. He felt, even amid the battle's chaos, a faint echo of the root's own presence, the familiar warmth of their ongoing dream contact bleeding faintly into his waking awareness, as though the fragment itself understood exactly what was happening and offered what quiet, wordless support it could manage from within its ancient containment. The battle's turning point arrived when Susan, having traveled personally from the Nine Peaks territory upon receiving word of the assault scale, joined the confrontation directly, her considerable strength and centuries of accumulated experience providing exactly the additional weight the coalition's defense needed to finally begin overwhelming the gatherers' coordinated assault. This is considerably more force than the Ashen Court, or even the Desert Threshold's attackers ever mustered, Susan observed, meeting a coordinated strike with practiced, overwhelming precision. The gatherer is not testing us anymore. This is a genuine attempt to breach the seal directly. Then we make sure it fails, Issei said, drawing on the full, accumulated weight of his coronated bloodline as he moved to meet the assault's most concentrated pressure directly, the same stubborn, unwavering resolve that had carried him through every previous crisis since a ruined gymnasium had first cracked open this ancient bloodline. Chapter 6. The battle's conclusion came only after hours of sustained, exhausting effort. The coalition's combined strength, now drawing on 5 separate traditions' accumulated experience and considerable power, finally overwhelming the gatherers' coordinated assault and forcing a withdrawal considerably more costly and disorganized than the calculated retreat the coalition had witnessed at the Desert Threshold weeks earlier. As the immediate danger passed, Issei found himself kneeling once more beside the ancient seal, checking carefully for damage amid the battle's considerable aftermath, and felt, with cautious relief, that the structure, while strained considerably beyond even its previous condition, had held. It's stable, he reported, as Susan conducted her own careful, experienced assessment alongside Meihua, who had arrived partway through the battle's later stages with a contingent of Gremory Clan reinforcements. Stable, but considerably weakened, Susan confirmed, her expression grave despite the battle's successful conclusion. This assault has cost the seal more than any single previous confrontation. We will need a reinforcement effort considerably more thorough than anything we've previously attempted, and even then, I am not confident it will hold indefinitely against another assault of this magnitude. The sobering assessment settled over the exhausted coalition, and Rias, finding Issei near the seal's edge as the immediate work of tending injuries and assessing damage continued around them, offered her own careful, strategic reflection on the day's considerable cost. The gatherer is done being patient, she said quietly. Whatever careful, generation-spanning strategy it maintained before your refusal, that's apparently given way to direct, escalating force. I don't think this is going to be the last assault of this scale, Issei. I think we need to prepare for the possibility that every remaining seal faces exactly this kind of pressure, sooner rather than later. I know, Issei said, exhaustion evident in his voice despite the battle's successful, if costly, conclusion. I keep thinking about what the root told me, in that first, clearer dream. That the gatherer has tried this before, across ages our history forgot, and never once succeeded through anything resembling kindness. That means it's failed before too, though. Every single time, across all those ages, it's failed. That's true, Rias said, something steadying in her tone despite the day's considerable weight. Whatever ancient pattern the gatherer represents, it has never once succeeded in claiming what it's after. I think that matters, Issei, more than the fear of facing another assault like today's. Solveig, joining the quiet conversation as the evening settled slowly over the battle-worn valley, offered her own thoughtful addition. In my own tradition's oldest stories, she said, there is a saying about patience meeting its match. That the most ancient hungers are not defeated through equal or greater force, but through something they have simply never learned to properly account for. I do not yet know what that something is, in our particular circumstance. But I find myself increasingly confident that whatever it eventually proves to be, your coalition, sovereign, is considerably more likely to discover it than any predecessor who faced this same ancient hunger alone. Nefret, having fought through her first genuine crisis alongside a coalition she'd only formally joined weeks earlier, approached as the evening's exhausted quiet settled further, her expression carrying the particular steadiness of someone who had, this day, proven her alliance's worth through action rather than mere word. I confess, she said, I did not fully understand, before today, Exactly how significant a threat you have all been quietly managing. My own threshold's earlier assault felt, in comparison, almost restrained. I am grateful, more than I can easily express, that I did not face something of today's scale entirely alone, the way my tradition's isolation would once have demanded. None of us should have to face this alone, Issei said. That's rather the entire point of everything we've built these past months. Kuroka, arriving to help with the battle's considerable aftermath, offered her own characteristically blunt assessment once the immediate crisis had fully passed. That was considerably nastier than anything we've faced before, Naya. Glad we had the extra prep time, or I don't like thinking about how that might have gone otherwise. Neither do I, Issei admitted. Thank you for the warning system that gave us that time in the first place. Don't mention it, Kuroka said, though something warmer lingered beneath her usual deflection. Just try not to make a habit out of these escalating crises, would you? I'm getting too old for this many close calls in 1 year. Word reached the coalition later that evening, relayed through one of Yasaka's attendants, that Tetsuya, upon hearing of the assault scale, had requested permission to contribute whatever limited assistance his own remaining knowledge of the Ashen Court's old intelligence networks might offer toward tracking the gatherers' movements going forward. Issei considered the request carefully alongside Yasaka, weighing the same careful balance of caution and genuine opportunity that had defined every step of Tetsuya's uncertain path back towards something resembling redemption. I think we should allow it, Issei said finally. Carefully, and with appropriate oversight. But I think today proved exactly why we need every piece of useful information we can gather, and I don't want to turn away help just because of where it's coming from. I agree, Yasaka said. Though I will ensure the oversight remains thorough. Trust extended carefully is still trust, Issei. It need not be trust extended blindly. As the coalition began the exhausted, careful work of standing down from the day's considerable battle, tending wounds and beginning preparations for the more thorough reinforcement Susan's assessment had indicated the seal urgently required, Issei found himself, once again, surrounded by the steadily expanding family of allies who had chosen, across 5 now formally united traditions, to stand beside him against a threat considerably older and more patient than anything this journey had previously demanded facing. Kunou, exhausted but proud, found her way to his side as the evening deepened, her earlier fear entirely replaced by quiet, steady resolve. We won, she said, mostly to herself, though loud enough for him to hear clearly. Even against something that big and scary. We actually won. We did, Issei agreed, offering her a tired but genuine smile despite the day's considerable weight. And we're going to keep winning, however many more times this ancient thing decides to test us. Not because we're not scared. Because we're not facing it alone. Later, once the household had settled into whatever exhausted rest the evening's considerable battle allowed, Issei found Yasaka once more on the residence's quiet veranda, the same familiar setting where so many of their most honest, unguarded conversations had unfolded across the preceding months. You held the seal today, she said, without turning, her gaze fixed on the stars scattered across the clearing sky. And you refused a proposition that, I suspect, carried more genuine temptation than you've admitted to anyone else. How did you know that? Issei asked, settling beside her, unsurprised that she'd somehow sensed what he'd tried to keep mostly to himself. Because I know you, Yasaka said simply. And because refusing power that promises to end fear entirely, that is never as simple as it sounds in the retelling. I do not think less of you for having felt that temptation, Issei. I think more of you for refusing it regardless. I keep thinking about what the gatherer said, Issei admitted. That it offered an end to fear. Part of me wanted that, just for a second. Not the power itself, just the not being scared anymore. That is a very human thing to want, Yasaka said gently. And a very human thing to set aside, in favor of something considerably harder to hold on to. Courage was never about the absence of fear, Issei. It has always been about choosing rightly despite it. You have proven that, again and again, since the very first night I met you. They sat together in comfortable silence a while longer, the quiet night settling gently around them, before Issei finally rose to find his own rest, carrying with him the same steady, hard-won resolve that had carried him through every uncertain turn of this long, expanding journey. somewhere beyond the valley's mist-shrouded edges, in 4 now formally connected seals scattered across traditions that had spent centuries believing themselves entirely isolated from one another, a patient, ancient hunger that called itself the Gatherer continued its own considerable, unbroken calculation, weighing its next move against the coalition that had, against every previous pattern of its long, unsuccessful history, refused to face it divided. Thanks for listening.